My entitled daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye and announced a brand new rule for my own kitchen. She said Mom can only eat the leftovers after the whole family is completely done eating. I did not scream or argue. I simply smiled. The very next day, I cooked absolutely nothing, and I delivered 6 little words that completely destroyed her perfect fake life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to put a toxic family member firmly in their place. My name is Yvonne, and I am 58 years old. I spent my entire life building my wealth from the absolute dirt up. I am a retired commercial real estate investor, and I own a stunning multi-million-dollar luxury estate that is completely paid off in full. I worked 80-hour weeks for decades making ruthless deals and sacrificing my own comfort just so I could enjoy my early retirement in absolute peace. But that hard-earned peace was completely shattered when my 32-year-old son Desmond asked if he and his wife Harper could move into my massive guest wing temporarily. Desmond is a software sales executive, and Harper is a 29-year-old lifestyle influencer. She is a white woman who portrays this incredibly perfect, wealthy, traditional wife aesthetic to her 2 million followers online. Desmond begged me, claiming they just needed a few short months to save up for a massive down payment on their own luxury home. Because he is my only son, I opened my heavy oak doors and welcomed them in. But temporary quickly turned into an absolute permanent nightmare. Harper started treating my beautiful home like it was her own personal content studio, and she started treating me like I was her unpaid domestic servant. The absolute boiling point happened last Sunday afternoon. I had spent 5 entire hours in my massive gourmet kitchen preparing a massive traditional soul food feast. I was making all of the deep comfort foods my son loved growing up. I had slow-cooked savory collard greens, baked a rich, creamy macaroni and cheese, candied yams swimming in brown sugar, and a massive pan of golden smothered chicken resting softly on the stove. The entire house smelled absolutely incredible. My feet were aching, and I was physically exhausted, but I was genuinely happy to do something nice for my family. I grabbed my favorite heavy ceramic plate from the upper cabinet and walked over to the hot stove to serve myself a small portion before formally calling them down to eat. Just as I lifted the heavy silver serving spoon, Harper marched aggressively into the kitchen. She was holding her expensive camera equipment, recording herself for her daily aesthetic vlog. When she saw me standing there about to put warm food onto my own plate, she practically sprinted across the marble floor. She stepped directly in front of the stove, physically blocking my body from the food I had just spent half the day cooking. She lowered her camera and looked at me with this sickeningly sweet, incredibly condescending smile. She told me she was starting a brand new aesthetic dietary routine for her channel, and she needed to plate all of the food perfectly for the camera before anyone else was allowed to touch it. I looked at her completely baffled by her absolute sheer audacity. I told her I was exhausted and hungry, and I was going to eat my food right now. Harper rolled her eyes dramatically and crossed her thin arms tightly over her chest. That is the exact moment she announced her ridiculous new house rule. She looked me up and down and said loudly that from now on, Mom can only eat the leftovers after the whole family is completely done eating. She claimed it was just how things were done in traditional high-society households, and she wanted to maintain that specific elegant standard for her online brand. I stood there staring at this arrogant, entitled little girl, completely unable to process the sheer magnitude of her blatant disrespect. I looked past her shoulder and saw my son Desmond walking quietly into the kitchen. He had heard every single word his wife just said. I looked directly into his eyes, waiting for him to step up and defend his mother in her own house. I waited for him to tell his cruel wife to step aside and show some basic human respect to the woman who gave him life. But Desmond did not say a single word. He looked down at the expensive hardwood floor, shifting his weight nervously, completely refusing to make eye contact with me. He was so incredibly terrified of upsetting his fake perfect wife that he was entirely willing to let her treat his own mother like a second-class citizen. He just stood there, completely silent, validating her toxic behavior with his pathetic cowardice. The silence in the large kitchen was absolutely deafening. Any other woman might have started screaming at the top of her lungs. Any other mother might have thrown that heavy ceramic plate right against the wall or cursed them both out right there on the spot. But I am not just any woman. I spent 30 years negotiating with ruthless corporate real estate developers, and I know exactly how to handle hostile takeovers. I know that whoever loses their temper first is the one who ultimately loses the war. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear of frustration. I looked at Harper's smug, arrogant face, and I looked at my cowardly, silent son. I simply smiled a slow, cold, highly calculated smile. I gently placed my empty plate down on the clean marble counter. I turned around and walked completely out of my kitchen without saying a single word. I walked upstairs to my master suite, locked the door, took a long hot bath, and ordered myself a massive, expensive steak dinner from a premium delivery service. I let them eat the food I cooked. I let them think they had completely won the power struggle. The very next evening, Desmond and Harper came walking down the grand sweeping staircase right at 6 o'clock, fully expecting another massive hot meal waiting for them on the dining table. But when they reached the bottom of the stairs, the entire house was completely dark and entirely quiet. They walked into the kitchen and stopped dead in their tracks. The stove was completely cold. The massive marble island was entirely empty. There were no pots boiling, no savory smells filling the air, and absolutely no signs of life. There was absolutely nothing prepared for them. Harper's face instantly dropped into a heavy scowl. She threw her expensive designer handbag onto the counter and let out a loud, dramatic sigh of pure annoyance. She started loudly demanding to know where dinner was, complaining that she was starving and had been filming aesthetic lifestyle content all day long. She yelled out into the empty hallway, asking why the kitchen was closed and where her food was. I was sitting quietly in the dark, formal dining room right off the main kitchen, sipping a very expensive glass of dark red wine. I slowly stood up from the velvet chair and walked smoothly into the kitchen, turning on the bright overhead lights. Harper glared at me, demanding to know why I had not cooked anything for the family tonight. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, tasting the rich, dark fruit notes, before setting the heavy crystal glass down on the counter. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered the 6 little words that were about to completely destroy her entire fake reality. "This is my house, you are evicted." Harper let out a loud, obnoxious laugh, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. She looked over at Desmond, smiling broadly like I had just told a hilarious joke. She actually told me to stop being so crazy and dramatic over a simple plate of leftovers. But I was absolutely not laughing. I reached into the deep pocket of my silk cardigan and pulled out a thick, folded piece of heavy legal paper. I tossed it effortlessly across the smooth marble island, letting it slide fast until it stopped perfectly in front of her manicured hands. It was an official, legally binding 30-day notice to vacate the premises, drafted and stamped by my personal real estate attorney that very morning. Her annoying laughter completely stopped. The heavy legal document slid smoothly across the cool marble island, coming to a complete stop right in front of Harper. The obnoxious grating sound of her laughter died instantly in her throat. She looked down at the thick cream-colored paper and saw the official embossed seal of my real estate attorney stamped clearly at the bottom. Her pale blue eyes widened slightly as she read the bold black text demanding she vacate the premises within 30 days. The sudden silence in the massive kitchen was heavy and completely suffocating. Desmond stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. He reached out with shaking hands and picked up the legal notice, staring at it like it was a highly explosive device. He looked from the paper to my perfectly calm face, his jaw dropping in absolute disbelief. "Mom, you cannot be serious," he stammered, his voice completely lacking any real masculine authority. "You are going to kick your own son and your daughter-in-law out onto the street over a plate of leftover food." He pleaded with me, begging me to stop being so incredibly dramatic and to just apologize to his wife so we could all go back to being a happy family. I looked at the boy I had carried for 9 months, the boy I had worked 80-hour weeks to put through the best private schools in the country. I felt a deep, profound disappointment settle heavily into my chest. He was completely emasculated by a woman viewing him merely as a convenient accessory for her fake lifestyle. I took another slow, elegant sip of my dark red wine and set the crystal glass down firmly on the counter. Desmond. I am not dramatic, I said, my voice incredibly steady. I am exercising my legal right as the sole property owner. I looked around my gorgeous, immaculate kitchen, gesturing to the high-end appliances and the custom-imported cabinetry. I bought this estate with my blood and tears. I paid off the massive mortgage years ago. You do not own a single brick of this foundation, Desmond. You are simply a guest in my home, and you have severely overstayed your welcome. I reminded him that I had graciously allowed them to move into my guest wing to save money for their own property, but they had completely abused my generosity. They had treated my sanctuary like a free luxury hotel and treated me like an unpaid servant. I told him the 30-day clock started ticking the exact second the paper touched the counter. Desmond opened his mouth to argue, to beg me for another chance, but Harper suddenly snatched the legal document right out of his trembling hands. The initial shock on her face had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating, and deeply arrogant smirk. She held the thick paper up in the bright kitchen lights, examining it with absolute, pure disdain. You really think a stupid piece of paper is going to make me pack my bags and leave my aesthetic sanctuary? She asked, her tone dripping with toxic condescension. She grabbed the top of the eviction notice and aggressively ripped the official document right down the middle. The loud tearing sound echoed sharply in the quiet room. She threw the torn pieces carelessly onto my marble counter, staring at me with absolute supreme entitlement. She took a step closer, crossing her arms tightly. "Let me educate you on how the real world works, Yvonne," she sneered, dropping the respectful act. "I have been living in this massive house for over 4 months now. All of my expensive influencer brand packages are delivered directly to this exact street address. My legal state identification card has this exact address printed right on the front. Do you know what that means in the state of Massachusetts? It means I have officially established legal residency." She smiled a twisted, evil little smile, completely thrilled by her own manipulative brilliance. She explained that she knew absolutely everything about tenant rights and squatter protections. She told me that because she legally resided here, I could not just throw her designer bags onto the front lawn and change the heavy locks. She said if I tried to forcefully remove her, she would simply call the local authorities and have me arrested for an illegal self-help eviction. I stood perfectly still listening to this incredibly arrogant white woman standing in the middle of a multi-million-dollar mansion paid for entirely by a black woman claiming she had the ultimate legal right to simply steal my physical space. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her threats was almost impressive. She leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the marble counter, her voice dropping into a mocking, arrogant whisper. "Go ahead and call the police right now, Yvonne. Call them and tell them you want your son and his pregnant wife out of your house. They will walk right through your front door, look at my mail, and tell you this is a civil matter. They will tell you that you have to take me to housing court. And we both know the court system is massively backed up. It will take you at least 6 to 8 agonizing months just to get a hearing on the docket. And during those 8 months, I am going to sit right here in this beautiful house, filming my content and eating my meals exactly when I want to. You cannot touch me." Desmond looked incredibly nervous, shifting his weight back and forth, completely terrified of the massive legal war his wife was actively declaring against his own mother. He tried to gently touch her arm to calm her down, but she completely shrugged him off, keeping her cold, pale blue eyes locked entirely on my face. She was directly daring me to fight her. She truly believed her basic knowledge of local housing loopholes made her entirely invincible. She thought my age made me weak and naive. She thought because I was retired, I simply did not have the energy or the massive financial resources to engage in a prolonged, brutal legal battle. She thought she had completely backed me into an inescapable corner in my own home. I looked at the torn pieces of the eviction notice scattered across my pristine counter. I did not yell or threaten her with physical violence. I simply looked at her and smiled again. This time the smile was absolutely freezing cold, entirely devoid of any human warmth. "You are completely right, Harper," I said, my voice echoing with absolute dangerous calm. "The local police will definitely say this is a civil matter and the courts are incredibly slow. but you are forgetting one very important detail about who I actually am." I leaned slightly forward, matching her aggressive posture. "I spent 3 decades in commercial real estate, managing massive corporate properties and dealing with the most ruthless corporate squatters on the entire planet. I know absolutely every single loophole in the property management handbook. I do not need the police to make you completely miserable." I turned my back on them, walking slowly out of the kitchen, leaving them standing in the deafening silence. They thought they had won the battle, but they had absolutely no idea the level of calculated warfare I was about to unleash upon their pathetic, privileged lives. The next morning, the bright summer sun beat heavily against the massive glass windows of the estate. Harper woke up in the guest suite completely drenched in uncomfortable, sticky sweat. She gasped for air, throwing off her expensive silk sheets, realizing the room was absolute boiling hot. She grabbed her cell phone to check the smart thermostat, but the screen would not load. The wireless internet router was now completely dead. She marched angrily into the attached luxury bathroom and turned the heavy silver handle of the shower, demanding a hot, relaxing wash, but only freezing cold water poured out of the massive rain shower head. She ran downstairs, her face red and furious, wearing her expensive silk pajamas. She found me sitting comfortably on the shaded back patio, sipping my fresh hot coffee, reading the morning financial newspaper. She screamed, demanding to know why the central air conditioning, the high-speed internet, and the hot water boiler were all completely shut off. I slowly lowered my newspaper, smiling pleasantly at her sweaty, furious face. "I am so incredibly sorry for the massive inconvenience," I replied smoothly, my tone entirely cheerful. "But as the sole legal homeowner, I have decided it is the perfect time to conduct some massive routine preventative maintenance on the entire property. The contractors might take a few weeks to finish their extensive inspections. It is perfectly legal to protect my investment. Enjoy the brutal, sweltering heat, my very dear entitled squatter." The brutal summer heat inside my massive estate became absolutely unbearable by noon. Without the powerful central air conditioning pumping through the high custom ceilings, the temperature inside the entire house climbed rapidly, turning the usually pristine, cool environment into a suffocating, uncomfortable sauna. Harper was entirely dependent on my high-speed internet connection to maintain her completely fabricated online aesthetic. She spent her entire morning pacing the hardwood floors of the guest wing, holding her expensive smartphone up in the air, desperately searching for a single bar of cellular service to upload her daily morning routine vlog. But my estate is located in a highly exclusive gated community, nestled deep within heavily wooded hills. The cellular reception out here is notoriously terrible without a strong wireless connection. I sat peacefully in my shaded sunroom sipping iced tea and watching her completely unravel. She was absolutely furious. She marched back and forth across the hallway, her face flushed and dripping with uncomfortable sweat, demanding that I turn the internet back on immediately so she could fulfill her lucrative brand sponsor contracts. I simply smiled and reminded her that the routine maintenance was going to take a considerable amount of time and suggested she go find a public coffee shop if she was truly that desperate for a wireless signal. She let out a loud, dramatic groan of pure frustration, completely realizing that her aesthetic image was entirely crumbling. She could not post her perfectly curated videos of her making expensive matcha lattes in my luxurious kitchen because the house was sweltering hot and the water running from the tap was freezing cold. She realized she was losing the physical war of attrition, and she needed a brand new strategy to force my hand. She needed to weaponize her massive online audience against me. I watched her storm back up the grand staircase, slamming the heavy wooden door of her bedroom completely shut. Inside that sweltering room, she was not packing her bags to leave like a normal person would. She was setting up her expensive ring light and positioning her high-definition camera. She realized that if she could not post her perfect, wealthy, traditional wife content, she was going to pivot to something that generated even more massive engagement online. She was going to play the ultimate victim. She sat down on the edge of the large guest bed, intentionally messing up her perfectly styled blonde hair and smudging her expensive mascara right under her eyes to make it look like she had been crying for hours. She spent another hour agonizing over the perfect camera angle, making sure the expensive silk curtains and the custom crown molding of my home were clearly visible in the background, so her followers could see exactly what was at stake. She wanted them to believe this was her hard-earned sanctuary. She practiced her fake sobbing in the mirror a few times, forcing tears to well up in her pale blue eyes. She knew exactly how to manipulate the algorithm, and she knew exactly how to manipulate human empathy. Once she was completely satisfied with her disheveled appearance, she pressed the bright red record button and began to weave a massive, intricate web of absolute lies. She started the video by staring silently into the camera lens, letting a single perfectly timed tear roll slowly down her cheek. Then she began speaking in a shaky, fragile whisper, completely different from the arrogant, demanding voice she used to scream at me in the kitchen. She told her 2 million followers that she was currently living in an absolute nightmare. She claimed that she and her husband Desmond had been trying to build a beautiful, loving home together, but they were being relentlessly tormented by her abusive, toxic mother-in-law. She completely left out the fact that she was living entirely rent-free in my fully paid-off multi-million-dollar estate. She completely left out the fact that she had boldly ordered me to only eat the leftover scraps of my own cooking in my own kitchen. Instead, she painted a horrifying picture of a cruel, aggressive woman who hated her simply because she was trying to be a good traditional wife to my son. The language she used was incredibly deliberate and deeply calculated. She weaponized her white female tears to tap into the oldest, most dangerous racial stereotypes imaginable. She described me as aggressive, hostile, and unreasonably angry. She claimed she was absolutely terrified to walk out of her own bedroom because of my unpredictable, violent outbursts. She held her hands up to her chest, shaking visibly for the camera, telling her massive audience that I was trying to forcefully make her and my unborn grandchildren completely homeless right in the middle of a brutal summer heat wave. She sobbed heavily, wiping her nose and claiming that I had maliciously cut off the air conditioning and the running water in an evil attempt to physically torture her. She sat there in my expensive guest room, wearing clothes bought with my son's salary, entirely funded by the shelter I provided, and played the role of the innocent, helpless victim perfectly. After she finished recording the incredibly dramatic 10-minute monologue, she spent another 2 hours heavily editing the footage. She added sad piano music, quietly playing in the background, to heavily manipulate the emotional response of her viewers. She cut out any parts where her fake crying sounded too forced and kept only the moments where she looked the most fragile and broken. Because the wireless internet was still completely disconnected, she actually drove her luxury sport utility vehicle down to a crowded local coffee shop just to use their free internet connection. She sat in her car in the parking lot and uploaded the massive high-definition video file directly to all of her social media platforms with a desperate, pleading caption asking her followers for prayers and support during this dark, traumatic time. She titled the video, "The Terrifying Truth About My Toxic Mother-in-Law." She hit publish and sat back waiting for the absolute chaos to completely unfold. She knew her followers were incredibly loyal and fiercely protective of her online brand. She knew they would immediately rush to her defense without ever asking to hear my side of the story. She returned to my sweltering estate that afternoon with a smug, triumphant smile on her face, completely confident that the sheer weight of public outrage would force me to turn the internet back on and completely drop the legal eviction notice. She thought she had effectively checkmated me using the immense power of her digital mob. The highly edited video went completely viral in less than 3 hours. It racked up over 5 million views, spreading rapidly across every single major platform. My quiet, peaceful retirement was instantly shattered. Her rabid followers quickly discovered my personal information online and began flooding my phone with incredibly vile messages. I started receiving horrifying death threats and disgusting racist comments from thousands of strangers who genuinely believed I was an evil, abusive monster. Desmond came rushing home from his corporate office that evening, his face pale with absolute panic. He marched into the living room and demanded that I immediately issue a public apology to Harper. He told me her brand sponsors were calling him and threatening to completely drop her lucrative contracts because of the massive family controversy. He actually begged me to turn the internet back on and beg for her forgiveness just to save her social media career. I looked at my cowardly son, completely disgusted by his absolute lack of a spine. I did not apologize. I did not shed a single tear. While Desmond and Harper were busy arguing in the sweltering living room, I simply walked upstairs and called my private locksmith. I had the heavy brass locks on the massive primary guest suite completely changed in under 10 minutes. I hired 2 large professional movers to take all of their expensive designer clothes, her elaborate camera equipment, their plush, expensive mattress, and their multiple suitcases, and carefully carry it all directly down the narrow stairs into my dark, damp, unfinished basement. The basement was incredibly cold, completely lacking any natural light, and heavily smelled of old damp concrete. When Harper and Desmond finally walked upstairs, completely expecting to sleep comfortably in the beautiful guest wing, they found a solid locked heavy oak door and a polite handwritten note taped firmly to the wood. The note simply said, "Squatters do not get luxury suites, enjoy the damp basement." The door at the top of the basement stairs remained locked all night. Down in the damp darkness, Harper and Desmond were forced to sleep on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by the musty smell of old boxes. There was no high-speed internet, no central air conditioning, and no luxurious silk sheets. Harper spent the entire night shivering and crying furiously that her aesthetic life had been reduced to an unfinished basement. She refused to let Desmond even touch her, completely blaming him for his absolute inability to control his own mother. Desmond simply sat entirely useless, offering weak apologies that only made her scream louder. The very second the sun came up and cast a tiny sliver of dim light through the small basement window, Harper grabbed her cell phone. Because she had no wireless internet, she had to stand directly on top of a stack of heavy cardboard boxes, pushing her phone right up against the dirty glass window just to get a single bar of cellular service. She immediately dialed her mother, Meredith. Meredith was a 55-year-old wealthy white woman who possessed the exact same toxic entitlement and absolute arrogance as her daughter. When Harper frantically explained that she had been locked in a cold basement, stripped of her luxury suite, and handed a legal eviction notice, Meredith completely lost her mind. She told her daughter to hang on and promised she was coming over immediately to fix the entire situation. Less than an hour later, a massive silver luxury sport utility vehicle came speeding up my long private driveway, entirely ignoring the posted speed limit signs. The heavy car screeched to a halt right in front of my grand entrance. I was sitting peacefully in my living room, sipping my hot morning coffee and reviewing my daily financial portfolios when the heavy brass knocker on my front door began pounding violently. The aggressive banging echoed through the entire massive estate. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, set the porcelain cup down gently on the glass coffee table, and walked smoothly to the front entrance. I did not rush. I unlocked the heavy door and pulled it open, revealing Meredith standing on my front porch. Her face was flushed a deep, angry red, her expensive blonde hair perfectly blown out, and her designer handbag clutched tightly in her pale hands. She did not even bother to say good morning. She shoved her way past me, stepping right into my grand foyer with absolute supreme arrogance, like she owned the entire property. She immediately started screaming, demanding to know where her precious daughter was, and asking how I dared to treat her family like common street criminals. I calmly closed the heavy front door, locking it securely behind her. I turned around, crossing my arms, and simply stared at this incredibly loud, obnoxious woman throwing a massive temper tantrum in my quiet, peaceful home. I told her that her daughter and my spineless son were currently residing in the basement suite until the 30-day eviction period officially expired. Meredith gasped loudly, clutching the pearls around her neck, looking at me with absolute sheer disgust. She took a step closer to me, her face twisted into a mask of pure toxic entitlement, ready to unleash a massive legal threat she thought would completely break my spirit. Meredith pointed a shaking finger at my face and told me I made a massive legal miscalculation. She proudly announced she had spoken to her expensive attorney on the drive over. She claimed locking Harper out of the guest suite and moving her belongings into the basement constituted an unlawful self-help eviction under state law. She raised her voice loudly, completely convinced her legal jargon was intimidating me. She threatened to file a massive civil lawsuit against me for severe emotional distress and illegal housing practices. She said her lawyer was preparing to sue me and force a judge to grant Harper permanent residency. But Meredith did not just stop at fake legal threats. She decided to cross a very dangerous line, leaning entirely into her deeply ingrained racial arrogance. She looked around my immaculate foyer, sneering at the expensive imported marble floors and the custom artwork hanging on my walls. She lowered her voice, dripping with toxic microaggressions. She told me it was incredibly ghetto to treat my own family members like common unwanted tenants. She said people from her social class actually understood family loyalty. She implied that despite my financial success, I was entirely devoid of any sophisticated breeding. She stood in my multi-million-dollar house and had the audacity to call me ghetto simply because I refused to let her entitled daughter walk all over me. Any other person might have exploded into a massive rage, but I remained perfectly still. I let her completely finish her racist, arrogant little speech. When she finally ran out of breath, I smiled a slow, freezing cold smile. I took a deliberate step toward her, instantly forcing her to take a nervous step backward. I kept my voice incredibly low and entirely deadly. I told Meredith she was incredibly bold to stand in my paid-off estate and threaten me with an expensive lawsuit. I asked her exactly how she planned to pay for this massive legal battle. The confident, arrogant smirk on her face instantly completely vanished. I told her that because I spent 30 years dominating the commercial real estate market, I had plenty of incredibly powerful friends at the major regional banks. I told her I knew for an absolute fact that her own beautiful suburban house was currently sitting in active pre-foreclosure. I watched the blood completely drain from her pale face. I continued speaking, detailing exactly how many months she was behind on her massive mortgage payments and exactly how much massive credit card debt she had secretly accumulated, trying to maintain her fake wealthy lifestyle. I told her she was completely drowning in financial ruin, and she was desperately hoping Harper could permanently secure a free luxury home because Meredith had absolutely nothing left to offer. I absolutely destroyed her fake aristocratic image right there in my foyer, exposing her as a completely broke, desperate fraud, trying to intimidate a woman who actually owned everything she touched. Meredith opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. She was completely paralyzed by the humiliating reality that I knew her darkest, deepest financial secret. She realized in that exact moment that she was entirely outmatched and completely out of her league. While I was busy completely dismantling Meredith and exposing her pathetic financial lies, I had absolutely no idea that Harper had finally managed to unlock the basement door and creep silently up the narrow stairs. Harper had been standing quietly in the shadows of the grand hallway, listening to every single word of our intense confrontation. She heard me completely destroy her mother fake legal threats, and she heard the absolute undeniable truth about her own family financial ruin. She realized in that exact terrifying moment that I was never going to back down. She realized that my eviction notice was entirely real, and her massive influencer brand was about to be completely destroyed when she became essentially homeless. Her mother could not save her because she was secretly completely broke. Harper was completely backed into a massive, inescapable corner. She knew she needed an explosive event to flip the narrative and regain absolute control over my house. I was standing near the bottom of the sweeping staircase, still staring coldly down at Meredith, who was trembling visibly with pure humiliation. Harper stepped silently out of the dark hallway and moved quickly behind me. She positioned herself perfectly on the third step from the bottom of the grand wooden staircase. I turned my head slightly, hearing the faint sound of her bare feet stepping softly against the polished hardwood. Before I could even fully turn around to see what she was doing, Harper looked directly at her horrified mother and let out a blood-curdling, completely terrifying scream. She did not trip, and she did not stumble. She intentionally threw her entire body violently backward, launching herself forcefully down the last 3 steps of the heavy wooden staircase. She crashed heavily onto the hard, imported marble floor of the foyer, landing awkwardly on her side, with a loud, sickening thud. She immediately grabbed her ankle, twisting her body wildly across the floor and screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. Her cries echoed deafeningly through the entire massive estate, sounding like she was being brutally attacked. Desmond came sprinting frantically up from the basement, his face entirely pale with absolute sheer panic. Harper looked up at Desmond, tears streaming rapidly down her face, and pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at my chest. She sobbed hysterically, claiming that we were just arguing and that I had violently pushed her forcefully right down the steep stairs. Harper lay on the cold, imported marble floor of my grand foyer, screaming as if she had been brutally attacked. Meredith immediately dropped to her knees beside her, entirely abandoning her previous arrogant posture. She began smoothing Harper's blonde hair and yelling frantically for someone to call for an ambulance. Desmond came sprinting up the basement stairs, taking 2 steps at a time, his face entirely devoid of any color. He rushed over to his wife, ignoring the fact that I was standing perfectly still, holding my ground. Harper looked up at Desmond with tears streaming down her pale face and pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. She sobbed hysterically, claiming that we were having a simple disagreement and that I had violently pushed her backward down the heavy wooden steps. Desmond did not even look at me to ask for my side of the story. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and immediately dialed 911, reporting a severe domestic assault. I stood there watching this entirely fabricated theatrical performance with absolute profound disgust. I had spent my entire life building a legacy of integrity, and my own son was using it as a stage for his manipulative wife. Less than 10 minutes later, the loud wail of police sirens echoed through my quiet gated community. 2 heavy police cruisers pulled into my circular driveway, their red and blue lights flashing brightly against the front windows of my estate. 3 local police officers rushed through the front door, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The very moment the officers stepped into the foyer, Harper elevated her performance to an absolute Oscar-worthy level. She clutched her perfectly fine right ankle, sobbing loudly and hyperventilating. She told the lead officer she was absolutely terrified for her life and that I had been physically threatening her for weeks. She claimed I wanted to force her out of the house so badly that I was willing to cause a fatal injury to make it happen. Meredith chimed in loudly, corroborating the entire absolute lie. She told the officers that I was a dangerous, aggressive woman who had just threatened her mere moments before throwing her pregnant daughter down the stairs. The police officers took out their notepads, looking around the massive, luxurious foyer and then looking directly at me. They saw a wealthy older black woman standing completely calm, and they saw 2 fragile, crying white women pointing fingers at me. The societal optics were entirely designed to work against me. Desmond stood up and told the police that he had run upstairs the exact second he heard his wife screaming and found me standing over her. He literally watched his own mother being falsely accused of a violent felony, and he actively participated in the character assassination just to appease the woman making his life miserable. The tall lead police officer completely ignored my calm demeanor. He walked slowly toward me, holding his hand out in a gesture that demanded absolute compliance. He told me that based on the multiple eyewitness testimonies and the apparent physical distress of the victim, he had no choice but to detain me while they conducted a full formal investigation. He demanded I place my hands behind my back. I looked at Desmond, my only child, the boy I protected and provided for his entire life. I waited for him to tell the officers his mother was not a violent criminal. I waited for him to finally find his spine. But Desmond completely looked away, staring blankly at the marble floor, shifting his weight nervously. He was entirely willing to watch his own mother get humiliated and potentially dragged to a dirty jail cell just so he could avoid an argument with his toxic wife. The absolute profound betrayal cut deeper than any legal threat Meredith had made earlier. I slowly turned around, placing my hands behind my back. The heavy steel police handcuffs clicked tightly around my wrists. The sharp metallic sound echoed in the massive foyer, sounding like a victory bell to Harper and her mother. Meredith smirked openly, crossing her arms in absolute triumph. She honestly believed she had just won the entire war. She thought she successfully removed me from my property, ensuring her daughter claimed total residency without interference. The lead officer held my arm gently but firmly, leading me toward the open front door to place me in the back of the police cruiser. He told me I would be formally processed at the precinct and held until a judge reviewed the severe assault charges. Harper let out a soft, dramatic whimper, burying her face into Desmond's chest, pretending to be completely traumatized by the entire ordeal. She was silently celebrating her manipulative victory. She truly believed that because I was handcuffed and walking toward a police car, my entire life was completely over. She thought my pristine commercial real estate reputation would be completely destroyed by a violent domestic assault charge. She thought she had completely checkmated me in my own beautiful home. But Harper was a foolish, arrogant little girl who completely misunderstood the type of woman she was dealing with. I did not build a multi-million-dollar real estate empire by being careless. When you manage commercial properties, you learn early on that people will lie, cheat, and steal to get what they want. You learn that the only thing that truly protects you in this world is undeniable hard evidence. I stopped walking right before we reached the heavy front door. I turned my head slightly, looking back at the officer holding my arm. I spoke in a voice so incredibly calm and composed that the officer visibly hesitated. I told the officer I completely understood he was just doing his job based on false information. But I also told him that before he placed a highly respected property owner into the back of his vehicle, he might want to review the actual facts of the incident. The officer frowned, looking confused. He asked me what I meant by that statement. I looked past him directly at Harper, who was still clutching her fake injured ankle. I smiled that same freezing cold smile I had given her the night I handed her the eviction notice. I asked the officer if he would kindly reach into the left pocket of my silk cardigan and pull out my digital tablet. The officer hesitated, looking at his partner, but my complete lack of resistance and calm demeanor convinced him to comply. He reached into my deep pocket and pulled out my small silver tablet, holding it carefully. I did not panic. I instructed the officer to tap the screen and open the security application located on the main dashboard. I looked directly at Harper and told her that when I changed the locks on the master suite yesterday, I also had my private security firm install hidden motion activated high-definition cameras all throughout the grand hallways and the main staircases. I told the police officer I did this specifically to protect my valuable assets from angry, vindictive squatters who might try to damage my beautiful property. The color instantly and completely drained from Harper's face. She stopped crying entirely, her mouth dropping open in absolute sheer terror. Meredith took a sudden step backward, clutching her designer bag, her arrogant smirk entirely erased. The police officer opened the application on my tablet and clicked on the most recent video file. The crisp, clear, high-definition 4,000-pixel footage began to play brightly on the screen. The room fell into deafening silence as the officers watched the undeniable truth unfold. The camera captured everything perfectly. It showed me standing calmly at the bottom of the staircase talking to Meredith. It showed Harper creeping silently out of the dark hallway, positioning herself carefully on the third step. And most importantly, it clearly showed her violently throwing her own body backward down the stairs without me ever raising a single finger or even turning around to look at her. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of a malicious, fabricated felony. The lead officer watched the video twice to be absolutely certain. His face hardened into a mask of pure professional anger. He realized he had just been completely lied to and manipulated by a fraudulent, dramatic performance. He immediately reached for his keys and unlocked the heavy steel handcuffs, removing them quickly from my wrists. He handed my tablet back to me and turned slowly toward Harper. He glared at her with absolute disgust and told her that filing a false police report and faking a violent assault was a severe criminal offense. He warned her that she was incredibly lucky I was not pressing immediate charges against her today. Harper sat completely frozen on the marble floor, her fake injury miraculously forgotten, entirely exposed as the pathetic, manipulative liar she truly was. The lead police officer glared at Harper with a level of absolute professional disgust that I will never forget. He had his hand resting on his radio, completely ready to arrest her for filing a false police report and fabricating a violent felony. The sheer panic in her pale blue eyes was incredibly satisfying to witness. She realized her massive theatrical performance had completely backfired, and she was staring directly at a legitimate criminal charge. Harper immediately shifted her strategy from playing the victim of a violent assault to playing the victim of a tragic accident. She began to sob hysterically, clutching her chest and claiming that the brutal summer heat and her intense pregnancy hormones had made her completely dizzy. She stammered and choked on her tears, telling the officer that she must have simply tripped over her own feet and fallen backward. She claimed her mind was completely disoriented from the sudden impact on the hard marble floor, and she genuinely thought someone had pushed her in the massive confusion. Meredith quickly chimed in, backing up her daughter with equally desperate lies. She told the police that the intense family argument had caused everyone to overreact and begged them to just let the unfortunate misunderstanding go. Desmond stood completely silent, looking at the floor, entirely terrified of the massive legal consequences his wife was currently facing. The lead officer was absolutely not fooled by their sudden change in narrative. He looked at the high-definition security footage on my tablet one more time, shaking his head at the blatant manipulation. He sternly warned Harper that local law enforcement did not appreciate being used as pawns in petty domestic disputes. He told her she was incredibly lucky that my security cameras had recorded the absolute truth. Otherwise, they would be hauling her away in handcuffs for wasting police resources. The officers turned around and walked out the front door, leaving the massive foyer entirely, completely silent. Harper sat on the floor, her face flushed with extreme humiliation and profound defeat. She refused to look at me. Desmond gently helped her up and silently escorted her down the dark, narrow stairs back into the damp basement. Meredith grabbed her designer handbag and rushed out the front door without saying another single word, completely abandoning her daughter in the middle of the mess she helped create. I locked the heavy front door and walked slowly back to my quiet living room. The war inside my home had completely escalated to a terrifying new level. Harper was entirely willing to send me to a cold prison cell just to secure a free luxury residence. Simply serving her a 30-day eviction notice was no longer going to be enough. If I only kicked her out, she would simply find another way to terrorize my life from afar. She would continue to weaponize her massive online following and paint me as the villain to her millions of followers. I realized in that exact moment that I needed a permanent and absolutely destructive solution. I needed to completely dismantle the fake empire she used to justify her toxic entitlement. I needed to strip away the wealthy aesthetic she paraded online and expose the pathetic reality hiding underneath. I sat down on my plush velvet sofa and opened my encrypted laptop. I spent 30 years dominating the commercial real estate market by knowing exactly how to uncover hidden liabilities and massive financial secrets. I knew that fake wealthy people always left a messy paper trail because their arrogance made them incredibly sloppy. It was time for me to stop playing the defensive mother-in-law and start acting like the ruthless corporate investor I truly was. I started my investigation by diving deep into my extensive network of real estate and financial contacts. During my long career, I had built incredibly strong relationships with senior bank managers, corporate auditors, and private wealth advisors across the entire state. I knew exactly how to track down public records, corporate filings, and limited liability company registrations. I opened a fresh encrypted search window and began running a comprehensive background check on the influencer brand Harper had built. Her social media profiles painted a picture of absolute immense success. She constantly posted pictures of herself wearing incredibly expensive designer clothing, carrying luxury handbags that cost more than most people make in an entire year, and staying at 5-star resorts across the globe. She claimed her lifestyle brand was a massive financial success and constantly bragged about her lucrative corporate sponsorships. I searched the state business registry and quickly located the official filing for her company. I pulled up the annual revenue reports, the tax filings, and the corporate credit history. I put on my reading glasses and began to meticulously comb through the massive spreadsheets, analyzing her income and her operating expenses with the ruthless precision of a federal auditor. It did not take me long to find the massive gaping holes in her perfectly curated digital life. When you look closely at the actual numbers, The truth always slowly begins to reveal itself. I cross-referenced her documented advertising revenue against her massive daily spending habits. I checked the public records for any real estate holdings, any legitimate corporate investments, or any tangible assets listed under her company name. There was absolutely nothing. Her entire business was a complete and absolute financial ghost town. The sponsored posts she bragged about were mostly low-tier affiliate links that generated pennies on the dollar. The exclusive brand deals she claimed to secure were nothing more than free product samples sent to thousands of other minor influencers. I dug even deeper, reaching out to an old colleague who specialized in digital marketing audits. I asked him to run a quiet diagnostic check on her 2 million social media followers. The results he sent back were absolutely staggering. Over 70% of her online audience was completely fake. They were automated bot accounts, purchased in massive bulk from overseas server farms to artificially inflate her online engagement and make her look incredibly popular. Her entire digital empire was a complete fabrication built entirely on lies and cheap purchased metrics. But what truly confused me was the physical money she was actively spending every single day. Even if her brand was a total failure, she was still walking around my house carrying genuine designer bags and wearing authentic luxury jewelry. I calculated her visible monthly expenses based on the items she flaunted in her videos. She was easily spending upward of $50,000 a month just to maintain the incredibly fake illusion of immense wealth. The math made absolutely zero sense. Her business was generating absolutely no profit, and Desmond was only a mid-level software sales executive. His annual salary could never possibly support a $50,000 a month shopping habit without putting them in massive, insurmountable debt. I checked their public credit reports and found they had excellent credit scores and zero outstanding personal loans. They were not drowning in massive credit card debt. The money was physical, it was real, and it was flowing into her hands from a completely unknown source. I sat back in my leather chair, staring intently at the glowing computer screen, my mind racing through all the terrible possibilities. She had to be stealing it, but I needed to find out exactly where the massive, unexplainable river of cash was originating. I needed physical access to their private financial records to find the missing link. I remembered the dark, damp basement where they were currently sleeping. When the movers carried their belongings downstairs, I saw a dusty black plastic storage bin filled with discarded electronics. Desmond kept old corporate laptops whenever his company issued him a brand new device. I waited until Tuesday morning when Desmond was working, and Harper was at a cafe stealing free internet. I unlocked the basement door and walked quietly down the wooden stairs. I found the black bin in a dark corner and opened it up. Sitting on top was Desmond's old silver laptop from his previous sales territory. I carried the computer upstairs to my office and plugged it into power. I booted up the machine holding my breath. Because Desmond was lazy, he had never wiped the hard drive or changed his password. I typed in his childhood dog name, and the screen immediately unlocked. I opened his file directory, searching for any hidden financial folders. Deep inside a randomly named system folder, I found a massive encrypted spreadsheet. I bypassed the simple protection and opened the document. The magnitude of what I was looking at made my blood run ice cold. The spreadsheet contained hundreds of detailed wire transfer receipts and hidden corporate account numbers. The massive amount of money Harper spent every month was not coming from a secret investor. It was coming directly from the corporate property management firm where Desmond was currently employed. She had actively convinced my incredibly cowardly son to help her commit massive corporate embezzlement just to successfully fund her absolutely fake designer wardrobe. I sat frozen in my home office staring at the glowing screen of my son's old silver laptop, completely unable to process the sheer magnitude of the financial crimes staring back at me. The encrypted spreadsheet I had just unlocked was not simply a record of minor corporate theft or small missing funds. It was a massive, highly sophisticated scheme of pure wire fraud and illegal embezzlement. I spent 30 years navigating complex commercial real estate transactions, so I knew exactly what I was looking at. Harper had not just convinced my cowardly son to skim a little extra money from his employer. She had actively and maliciously forged Desmond's signature to take out massive secondary mortgages on several highly lucrative commercial properties that his company officially managed. She used his executive access credentials to bypass the internal corporate security protocols, completely manipulating the digital asset ledgers to make the properties appear entirely unencumbered. Once the fraudulent loans were approved by unsuspecting online lenders, the massive influx of cash was quietly wired directly into a series of shell company bank accounts that Harper had secretly registered under her fake influencer brand name. She was systematically draining the equity out of buildings she did not even own, completely stealing millions of dollars to fund her pathetic, fake, wealthy aesthetic. I cross-referenced the dates of the massive wire transfers with the dates she posted pictures of her brand-new designer handbags and her lavish luxury vacations. The timelines matched absolutely perfectly. She was committing severe federal wire fraud every single time she wanted to buy a new, expensive outfit for her 2 million fake social media followers. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her criminal enterprise made my stomach turn violently. She was risking decades in a federal prison just to pretend she was a traditional wealthy housewife online. I printed out the massive spreadsheets, the forged loan applications, and the undeniable bank routing numbers, stacking the thick pile of heavy paper perfectly on my solid mahogany desk. I felt a deep, profound sadness washing completely over me. I had raised Desmond to be an honest, hardworking man. I paid for his expensive college degree so he could build a legitimate, successful career in software sales. But he had completely thrown his entire life away for a toxic, manipulative woman who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient accessory and a legal shield for her massive financial crimes. I needed to know exactly how much he actually knew. I needed to know if my only child was merely an innocent victim of his wife's sociopathic manipulation, or if he was an active, willing participant in this massive federal felony. I closed the laptop and locked the thick stack of printed evidence securely inside my desk drawer. I waited patiently in my dark office, listening closely to the quiet sounds of the massive estate. Right around 6 o'clock that evening, I heard the heavy front door open and close. I heard Desmond's tired footsteps echoing heavily against the imported marble floor of the grand foyer. Harper was still out at a local cafe, desperately stealing free internet, so Desmond was completely alone in the house. This was the absolute perfect opportunity to confront him privately without his toxic wife pulling his strings. I walked out of my office and stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at my son. I called his name, my voice incredibly calm and completely devoid of any emotion. I told him to come upstairs to my office immediately because we needed to have a very serious private conversation about his corporate management properties. Desmond walked slowly up the heavy wooden stairs looking incredibly exhausted and completely defeated. He followed me silently into my home office, and I shut the heavy mahogany door firmly behind him, locking it securely. He slumped down into the leather guest chair, rubbing his tired eyes and asking me what I wanted. I did not waste any time with polite small talk or gentle motherly coddling. I unlocked my desk drawer, pulled out the thick stack of printed financial documents, and threw them aggressively across the desk, directly in front of his face. I watched his eyes scan the top page. The color completely vanished from his face in a single instant. He recognized the forged secondary mortgage applications and the shell company bank routing numbers immediately. He began to hyperventilate, clutching his chest and looking around the quiet office like a trapped animal. I looked at him with absolute pure disgust and asked him how long he had known that his wife was completely stealing corporate funds and committing massive federal wire fraud using his executive signature. I fully expected him to break down in tears to beg for my help, or to tell me that Harper had completely manipulated him without his knowledge. Instead, the absolute unthinkable happened. The fear in his eyes completely vanished, replaced by a sudden violent surge of pure defensive anger. He jumped up from the leather chair, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. He did not get mad at his wife for destroying his career and his entire future. He got mad at me. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, completely blaming me for snooping through his discarded personal belongings. He told me I had absolutely no right to hack into his old laptop and invade his private family business. I stood up from my desk, entirely completely shocked by his pathetic reaction. I told him he was actively covering up a massive federal felony and his wife was going to drag him directly down to a cold prison cell. Desmond slammed his hands violently onto my mahogany desk, leaning forward with a twisted, aggressive expression I had never seen on his face before. He admitted everything right then and there. He yelled that he knew exactly what Harper was doing for the past 6 months. He admitted he discovered the forged secondary mortgages when an internal corporate auditor flagged a suspicious digital transaction. But instead of reporting his toxic wife to the authorities, he chose to actively help her cover up the massive financial crimes. He completely panicked because he knew if the company found out about the massive wire fraud, he would be entirely ruined and Harper would absolutely leave him. He desperately wanted to keep his fake perfect life and his beautiful blonde wife, so he used his high-level executive clearance to permanently delete the audit logs and completely bury the massive paper trail. He was actively destroying evidence every single day just to keep her out of prison. I looked at the man standing in front of me and realized he was absolutely not my son anymore. He was a cowardly, pathetic criminal, completely corrupted by his own desperate need for fake high society validation. He told me that they just needed a few more months to secure a massive brand deal for her influencer company so they could quietly pay back the stolen corporate funds before the annual board review. I told him he was completely delusional and that the federal government was eventually going to catch them. He glared at me, breathing heavily, his face twisted into a mask of pure, toxic arrogance, entirely matching his wife. The tension in my home office reached an absolute breaking point as I stared into the eyes of the man I no longer recognized. I told Desmond that I was not going to sit quietly and watch him completely destroy his entire life for a fake aesthetic lifestyle. I warned him that if he did not march straight down to the local Federal Bureau of Investigation office and confess everything immediately, I was going to hand all of this printed evidence directly over to the authorities myself. The very second I issued that ultimate demand, Desmond completely lost his remaining sanity. He walked slowly around my heavy mahogany desk, entirely invading my personal space. The cowardly boy I had raised was completely gone, entirely replaced by a desperate, cornered criminal willing to do absolutely anything to protect his massive, fraudulent secret. He looked down at me, his voice dropping into a dark, terrifying whisper that sent absolute chills entirely down my spine. "If you expose her, I go to jail too," he hissed, his face completely red with pure venomous rage. "I will lose absolutely everything I have ever worked for, and I am not going to let you ruin my perfect family over a stupid corporate mistake." He took another incredibly aggressive step forward, completely trapping me against my own desk. "Back off right now, or I swear to God, I will completely destroy your entire life." He threatened, his tone absolutely deadly and entirely serious. "I will hire the most ruthless lawyers in the state, and I will file for immediate legal guardianship over you. I will legally claim you have severe advanced dementia, and I will take this multi-million-dollar house forcibly. You will absolutely rot all alone in a cheap state-funded nursing home forever." The terrifying threat my son made in my quiet home office was not just an angry bluff born from massive financial panic. Desmond had completely crossed the absolute ultimate line of betrayal, and he was entirely ready to execute his monstrous plan. 3 days after our intense confrontation, the heavy brass knocker on my front door sounded loudly. I walked across the imported marble foyer and opened the heavy wooden door, completely expecting a delivery package. Instead, I found Desmond and Harper standing on my front porch, accompanied by a tall man wearing a highly expensive custom-tailored gray suit. The man held a thick black leather briefcase and wore an incredibly arrogant expression that matched Harper perfectly. Desmond pushed his way past me without saying a single word, completely invading my peaceful sanctuary once again. Harper followed right behind him, carrying a thick manila folder, her face twisted into a deeply fake expression of profound sorrow. The tall man introduced himself as a senior partner at a highly ruthless corporate law firm in the city. He walked directly into my formal living room and sat down on my plush velvet sofa completely uninvited, acting like he owned absolutely everything. I remained entirely calm, standing near the doorway observing this pathetic coordinated ambush. The corrupt lawyer opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of highly official-looking medical documents. He placed them carefully on my glass coffee table, tapping the paper with his expensive gold pen. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes and stated that he was formally representing my son in a highly sensitive family legal matter. He claimed that Desmond had grown incredibly concerned about my rapidly declining mental state and my sudden bizarre hostile behavior toward my own loving family members now. The corrupt lawyer smoothly slid the medical documents across the glass table directly toward me. He explained that my son had recently consulted with a highly respected private neurologist regarding my sudden memory lapses and my aggressive paranoid delusions. I looked down at the forged medical papers and saw the signature of a completely shady doctor I had never even met in my entire life. The document officially diagnosed me with severe early-stage Alzheimer's disease, claiming I was a massive danger to myself and entirely incapable of managing my own massive real estate portfolio and completely complex financial assets. The sheer breathtaking audacity of their coordinated medical fraud made my blood run completely ice-cold. They had actively bribed a corrupt medical professional to permanently strip away my legal autonomy and completely steal my multi-million-dollar estate. Desmond sat on the sofa, entirely refusing to look me directly in the eyes, completely unable to face the massive, horrific betrayal he was actively orchestrating against the woman who gave him life. He was entirely willing to legally declare his own mother mentally incompetent and completely lock me away in a tiny room just to hide his horrific wire fraud. Harper stepped forward, completely taking control of the entire pathetic theatrical performance. She walked over to me wearing a soft pastel cardigan and completely masking her toxic personality behind the fake, gentle smile of a deeply concerned family caretaker. She reached out and tried to gently grab my hand, but I immediately snatched my arm away from her toxic grip. She let out a long, dramatic sigh, entirely pretending to be deeply exhausted by my difficult, uncooperative behavior. She looked at the corrupt lawyer, shaking her head sadly, before turning her pale blue eyes directly back to my calm face. "We love you so incredibly much, Mom," she whispered, her voice dripping with absolute fake sincerity and toxic manipulation. "We know you are completely confused right now, and we know your sick brain is making you act out aggressively against the people who care about you the most." She pointed down at the forged medical documents sitting on the glass table, completely weaponizing the fake diagnosis to justify her massive hostile takeover. She claimed that my unprovoked decision to move them into the damp basement and turn off the air conditioning was a clear, undeniable sign of severe mental dementia. Harper continued her disgusting fake monologue, entirely meant for the corrupt lawyer to formally witness and document. She stated that the massive luxury estate was simply too large and entirely too dangerous for a sick elderly woman to manage all by herself. She claimed that Desmond was legally stepping up to become my primary medical conservator and my permanent financial guardian. She told me they had already begun drafting the heavy legal paperwork to completely seize absolute control over all my bank accounts, my retirement funds, and the permanent property deed to this multi-million-dollar luxury estate right now. The corrupt lawyer leaned forward, entirely, completely backing up her massive, fraudulent claims. He told me that fighting this legal guardianship petition in a public court would be incredibly long, deeply humiliating, and entirely exhausting for a sick older woman. He stated that judges almost always side with the young, capable family members when severe cognitive decline is officially documented by a licensed medical professional. Harper smiled her cold, toxic smile, completely dropping the fake caring caretaker act for just a brief, chilling second. She leaned entirely into my personal space, delivering her absolute, ultimate, disgusting ultimatum directly to me. "We do not want to put you into a cheap, terrible state-run nursing home where they completely forget about you," she whispered maliciously. "We want you to stay right here in your beautiful house while we take completely over and manage everything perfectly for you." She told me that if I simply sat down quietly and signed the permanent property deed completely over to Desmond today, they would graciously allow me to live out my remaining confused years peacefully in the guest wing. She completely threatened to lock me away in a dirty facility if I refused them today. She thought she had completely checkmated me, entirely backing me into a massive, inescapable legal corner in my own living room. They truly believed their highly expensive corrupt lawyer and their forged medical diagnosis would completely terrify an elderly woman into immediately surrendering her entire massive fortune. Desmond finally looked up from the floor, completely expecting to see me break down into hysterical tears of absolute defeat. He completely expected me to reach for the expensive gold pen and simply sign my entire life away to protect myself from a cold, lonely death inside a terrible state-run medical facility. Instead of crying or begging for their fake mercy, I looked at the three pathetic, arrogant criminals sitting in my living room, and I began to completely laugh. I let out a loud, massive, echoing laugh that completely filled the entire grand estate. It was not a nervous, fragile chuckle, but a deep, powerful, booming laugh of absolute, pure, unadulterated victory. The corrupt lawyer frowned, entirely confused by my completely confident reaction. Harper took a nervous step backward, her toxic smirk instantly fading into a look of absolute sheer panic as she realized her massive trap had completely, entirely failed. "You are completely pathetic, Desmond," I said, my voice completely devoid of any fear and entirely filled with absolute, pure, commanding authority. I looked directly at my terrified, cowardly son, exposing his massive arrogance. "You truly thought you could outsmart a woman who spent 30 years dominating massive corporate real estate syndicates. You thought a cheap, corrupt lawyer and a fake medical document could simply steal my massive empire." I reached completely into the deep inner pocket of my tailored silk blazer and pulled out a thick, heavy, legally certified document completely stamped by the absolute highest state government offices. I threw the heavy certified document aggressively onto the glass coffee table, right on top of their pathetic, forged medical papers. The corrupt lawyer immediately leaned forward, picking up my document and scanning the dense legal text rapidly. I watched the blood completely drain from his arrogant, pale face, entirely realizing he had just walked directly into a massive legal brick wall. I looked dead into Harper's terrified, pale blue eyes, entirely destroying her massive fake influencer reality. "You cannot legally take the permanent property deed to this massive, beautiful estate. Desmond," I announced smoothly and entirely triumphantly, "right now. Because I legally completely transferred the absolute ownership of this entire massive multi-million-dollar estate directly into an impenetrable, irrevocable, blind trust exactly 3 years ago." I smiled my absolutely coldest, most terrifying smile, completely watching their entire pathetic, hostile takeover crumble into absolute dust. "I do not personally own this massive house anymore, and you absolutely cannot steal an asset from a person who does not legally possess it. I am simply a protected lifetime tenant living here completely safely, just like you. Your fake medical papers are completely, entirely, and absolutely totally useless in this massive house." The corrupt lawyer practically sprinted out of my grand foyer the exact second he realized his massive legal trap had completely failed. Desmond and Harper stood in my living room entirely frozen in absolute sheer panic. Their pathetic attempt to declare me mentally incompetent had crashed into an impenetrable brick wall of ironclad estate planning. I did not say another single word to them. I simply pointed toward the basement door and watched them slink away like the pathetic, cowardly criminals they truly were. I had completely won the massive legal battle, but I knew Harper was absolutely not finished. When toxic, entitled people realize they have entirely lost control, they do not simply surrender and apologize. They resort to pure, malicious destruction. The very next morning, I had a highly confidential meeting scheduled with my private real estate attorney in the city to finalize the exact legal parameters of their upcoming formal eviction. I locked my home office and drove my sedan down the long, winding driveway, completely leaving the estate entirely empty. Down in the dark, damp basement, Harper was pacing the concrete floor like a rabid, feral animal. She had spent the entire night screaming at Desmond, completely blaming him for my brilliant financial foresight. She realized with absolute terrifying clarity that she was never going to legally steal my massive multi-million-dollar house. She was never going to own my pristine aesthetic marble kitchen or my sweeping grand staircase. She was going to be completely evicted and forced to face the massive federal wire fraud she had actively committed. The sheer terrifying reality of her impending ruin twisted her toxic mind into a state of absolute, pure, blinding rage. She needed to hurt me physically and emotionally. She needed to destroy something I deeply loved, simply because she could not completely destroy my life. Harper crept silently up the basement stairs and walked into my main living room. She bypassed the expensive electronics and the heavy silver centerpieces. She knew exactly what to target. In the far corner of my formal den, sitting proudly on a custom mahogany stand, was my late husband, pristine antique vinyl record collection. My husband had spent 30 entire years carefully curating that massive, beautiful collection before he passed away. It contained original pressings, rare jazz albums, and the very first record we ever danced to on our wedding night. It was an irreplaceable, deeply sacred piece of my heart, and the only physical piece of his beautiful soul I had left in this world. Harper walked over to the mahogany stand, her pale blue eyes completely filled with absolute toxic malice. She did not hesitate for a single second. She grabbed a massive stack of the vintage records and threw them violently onto the hardwood floor. She stomped her feet directly onto the fragile black vinyl, intentionally crushing the beautiful music into thousands of sharp, jagged pieces. She tore the rare cardboard sleeves entirely in half, tossing the beautiful vintage artwork carelessly across the room. She spent 20 entire minutes systematically and brutally destroying the most precious, irreplaceable memories of my entire life. She smashed every single record until my beautiful den looked like an absolute massive disaster zone, completely covered in sharp, broken black shards. She was entirely satisfied with her horrific, malicious sabotage. I returned to my quiet estate a few hours later, feeling incredibly confident about the strict legal eviction timeline my attorney had just drafted. I unlocked the heavy front door and walked peacefully into the grand foyer. The house was entirely silent, but I immediately felt a massive, heavy shift in the atmosphere. I took off my light coat and walked slowly into my formal den. The absolute horrific sight before me made my breath completely stop in my chest. My beautiful mahogany record stand was completely empty. The entire hardwood floor was entirely covered in massive piles of shattered black vinyl and torn cardboard sleeves. The vintage records my late husband had spent his entire life collecting were completely and absolutely destroyed. I fell to my knees, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the profound emotional violence inflicted upon my peaceful home. I carefully picked up a jagged piece of black vinyl, recognizing the bright yellow label of the very first song we danced to on our wedding day. A single hot tear rolled slowly down my cheek, completely breaking my stoic composure for the very first time. I heard soft footsteps approaching the den, and I slowly looked up. Harper was standing casually in the doorway, holding a yellow feather duster in her pale hand. She looked completely relaxed, wearing a fake, innocent smile that made my blood boil with absolute, pure, unfiltered rage. "Oh my goodness, Yvonne," she gasped, placing a dramatic hand over her chest, feigning absolute shock. "I am so incredibly sorry about this massive mess. I was simply trying to help out by dusting the old shelves, and the entire stand just suddenly collapsed. It was a complete and total accident while I was doing my morning cleaning." She looked down at the thousands of shattered pieces and completely shrugged her shoulders, showing absolutely zero genuine remorse for destroying the only connection I had left to my husband. Desmond walked into the room a few seconds later, completely stopping dead in his tracks when he saw the massive, absolute devastation covering the floor. He looked at his wife, fake, innocent expression, and then looked down at my heartbroken face. I waited for him to finally express some genuine, absolute anger toward the woman who had just maliciously destroyed his own father's beautiful legacy. Instead, Desmond let out a loud, exasperated sigh, entirely annoyed that he had to deal with another massive family conflict. "Mom, please do not make a massive dramatic scene over some dusty old music," he said, his voice dripping with completely pathetic cowardice. It was obviously just a simple accident. You can just go online later today and buy brand new ones to replace them. I stared at my only son, completely disgusted by his absolute profound emotional blindness. He actually told me to simply purchase a replacement for a sacred, deeply personal 30-year-old collection that held the absolute core memories of his deceased father. He was completely willing to ignore the blatant malicious sabotage simply because he was absolutely terrified of confronting his toxic wife. They stood there completely united in their arrogant ignorance, expecting me to absolutely lose my mind and start screaming uncontrollably at them. They wanted me to completely break down so they could use my emotional reaction to paint me as an unstable, aggressive woman. I did not yell or scream at them at all. I completely swallowed the massive, deep, agonizing lump in my throat and stood up from the hardwood floor. I looked Harper dead in her pale blue eyes, and I gave her a completely blank, empty stare that made her fake, innocent smile instantly falter. I did not utter a word to them. I simply walked over to the hallway closet, grabbed a large broom, and quietly began sweeping up the shattered pieces of my beautiful broken heart. I carefully scooped the black, jagged shards into a heavy trash bag, mourning every single piece in absolute, total silence. They eventually got bored of my lack of reaction and completely walked away, heading back down into their damp, dark basement. They truly thought they had gotten away with their horrific emotional violence, but they completely forgot that a quiet woman is the most dangerous force on the entire planet. The very next morning, Harper and Desmond left the estate to run their daily errands. The second their car disappeared down the long driveway, I walked directly into the basement carrying massive, heavy-duty industrial trash bags. I walked straight over to the temporary clothing racks where Harper had hung her entire massive collection of incredibly expensive designer clothes and luxury handbags. These were the exact same items she had fraudulently purchased using the massively embezzled corporate funds. I did not tear or destroy a single thread. I grabbed every designer dress, every pair of luxury shoes, and every authentic leather handbag and stuffed them aggressively into the thick black bags. I loaded all 10 massive bags into the back of my spacious sport utility vehicle and drove directly to a local domestic violence shelter for women. I happily donated absolutely everything she owned, giving her fake wealthy aesthetic to women who deserved a fresh start. When Harper came home that afternoon, she walked down into the basement and let out a completely blood-curdling scream of absolute pure horror. She found her entire walk-in closet completely stripped bare. I stood at the top of the basement stairs looking down at her absolutely devastated, sobbing face. I smiled coldly, stating I had completed some routine cleaning and removed the abandoned property from my basement floor. The blood-curdling scream that echoed from the dark basement was absolute music to my ears. Harper stood frozen at the bottom of the wooden stairs, paralyzed by the massive empty space where her luxury wardrobe used to be. Every single leather handbag, every silk dress, and every pair of expensive designer shoes was completely gone. I had packed all of it into black trash bags and donated the entire collection to a local shelter for women. Harper fell to her knees on the cold concrete floor, sobbing hysterically and frantically clawing at the empty metal clothing racks. She demanded that Desmond call the local police immediately to report a grand larceny theft. She screamed that I had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of her luxury property and that she was going to have me locked inside a federal prison cell for the rest of my life. But Desmond just stood there completely silent, his face pale and covered in a layer of cold sweat. He knew exactly why they could never call the authorities to investigate the missing designer goods. If the police came to my estate and started asking questions about how a software sales executive and an unemployed social media influencer afforded $500,000 in luxury fashion, the massive corporate embezzlement scheme would be instantly exposed. They would have to provide receipts and financial statements to prove ownership, and that massive paper trail would lead federal investigators directly back to the forged secondary commercial mortgages. Harper realized this terrifying fact a few moments later. Her loud, aggressive screaming suddenly stopped, completely replaced by a pathetic, quiet whimpering. She was entirely trapped by her own massive financial crimes. She could not publicly defend her stolen property without exposing herself as a massive federal criminal. She had to sit there in the dark, damp basement and completely accept the absolute total loss of her fake, wealthy aesthetic. Over the next few days, the heavy reality of her impending doom began to completely crush her arrogant spirit. She could no longer film her perfectly curated lifestyle videos because she had absolutely nothing expensive to wear, and her background was a dirty, unfinished concrete wall. Her fake online empire was rapidly crumbling into absolute dust. But the most terrifying reality crashing down upon her toxic world was the calendar hanging in my kitchen. The legally binding 30-day eviction notice I had served them on the Marble Island was officially expiring in exactly 1 week. In exactly 7 days, I was going to legally force them out of my massive multi-million-dollar estate, and they had absolutely nowhere else to go. Meredith was completely broke and facing massive foreclosure, so they could not stay with her. They were entirely out of options and completely out of time. Harper was backed into an inescapable corner, and she realized she needed a massive nuclear option to manipulate my emotions and force me to cancel the legal eviction completely. She spent 2 entire days locked inside the dark basement, completely refusing to speak to anyone while she meticulously crafted her final desperate emotional trap. She knew that my age and my deep maternal instincts were her very last remaining targets. She believed that despite all the horrific psychological warfare and the massive financial crimes, she could simply play the ultimate biological trump card to completely neutralize my ruthless corporate boundaries. She was entirely convinced that I would completely drop my defenses and surrender my beautiful home if she presented me with the one absolute thing every single aging mother supposedly desperately desires. On a quiet Tuesday evening, just 5 days before the massive legal eviction was officially scheduled to be executed, Harper slowly walked up the basement stairs. She asked me to sit down in the formal living room because she needed to call an emergency family meeting to discuss something incredibly serious. I sat calmly on my plush velvet sofa, crossing my legs and completely preparing myself for another pathetic theatrical performance. Desmond followed closely behind her, his eyes entirely red and swollen, like he had been crying heavily all afternoon. Harper looked absolutely terrible. She was wearing cheap, oversized sweatpants, and her blonde hair was completely messy, entirely abandoning her perfect aesthetic image. She walked over to the glass coffee table and stood directly in front of me, taking a deep, dramatic breath. Her pale blue eyes immediately filled with heavy fake tears that rolled slowly down her cheeks. She reached into her oversized pocket with trembling hands and pulled out a small white plastic stick. She placed the plastic stick gently onto the glass table directly in front of me. Sitting right beside the stick, she placed a glossy black and white medical photograph. It was a positive pregnancy test and a standard medical ultrasound picture showing a tiny gray shape. Harper collapsed onto the sofa across from me, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. She claimed she had just come back from a free local clinic and received the absolute most shocking news of her entire life. She looked up at me, her face completely stained with fake tears, and announced that she was officially pregnant with my very first grandchild. Desmond immediately dropped heavily to his knees right beside my sofa, grabbing my hands tightly and crying right along with his toxic wife. Harper told me that the severe emotional stress of the impending eviction, the brutal summer heat, and the horrific conditions of living in a damp concrete basement were actively destroying her physical health. She claimed the clinic doctor had specifically warned her that she was experiencing a highly dangerous high-risk pregnancy and that any further severe stress would absolutely guarantee a massive tragic miscarriage. She cried harder, holding her stomach protectively and begging me to please show some basic human compassion for the innocent unborn baby growing inside her. She told me she knew she had been difficult and deeply arrogant, but she was entirely willing to completely change her toxic behavior if I would just allow them to stay in the safety of my massive luxury estate. Desmond squeezed my hands desperately, looking up at me with absolute pathetic, pleading eyes. "Mom, you absolutely cannot kick a pregnant woman out onto the cold street," he begged, his voice cracking with heavy emotion. "This is your very own flesh and blood growing inside her right now." He pleaded with me to completely rip up the legal eviction notice and just let them move back upstairs into the primary guest suite so his wife could have a safe, comfortable environment to carry my beautiful grandchild. He completely weaponized the concept of family legacy, trying to make me feel like an evil, cruel monster for aggressively enforcing my own property rights against a fragile, pregnant woman. They sat there sobbing heavily, completely expecting me to instantly melt into a puddle of emotional joy and deep grandmotherly instinct. They thought I would immediately jump up from the sofa, hug them both tightly, and completely surrender my entire life to accommodate the new baby. I did not jump up from my plush velvet sofa. I did not shed a single tear of joy or wrap my arms around my cowardly son. I sat perfectly still, looking completely unaffected by their massive emotional performance. I spent my entire career as a commercial real estate investor meticulously auditing highly complex corporate financial documents to uncover hidden lies and massive structural frauds. You do not survive 3 decades in corporate boardrooms by blindly accepting shiny presentations without carefully reading the fine print. I slowly leaned forward and calmly picked up the glossy black and white ultrasound photograph from the glass coffee table. I held the smooth paper up to the bright light of the living room lamp, ignoring their loud, dramatic sobbing entirely. My sharp eyes automatically scanned the image, bypassing the blurry gray shape in the center and moving directly toward the tiny white text printed across the top margin of the photograph. When clinics print ultrasound images, they generate a digital timestamp and the exact legal name of the patient onto the film to prevent administrative mix-ups. I narrowed my eyes slightly, focusing on the small white letters. I read the official date printed clearly in the upper right-hand corner. The ultrasound was not taken this afternoon at a local free clinic. The date printed on the photograph was from exactly 4 years ago. I slowly shifted my gaze to the top left corner of the paper to read the registered patient name. The name printed in bright white letters was absolutely not Harper. The name printed clearly on the medical document was Meredith. Harper had entirely fabricated a massive, fake, high-risk pregnancy to steal my house, and she was stupid enough to use her own mother-old ultrasound photograph to try and fool a retired federal financial auditor today. I sat perfectly still on my plush velvet sofa, holding the glossy black and white medical photograph in my steady hands. The tiny white text printed clearly in the corner screamed the absolute, undeniable truth right directly into my eyes. The name Meredith and a date from exactly 4 years ago were permanently stamped on a medical document that Harper was currently using to fake a highly dangerous pregnancy. The sheer magnitude of her sociopathic manipulation was absolutely staggering. She was willing to fake the existence of my first grandchild just to maintain her free housing and avoid facing the financial crimes she committed. Any other mother would have completely lost her mind. Any other woman would have thrown that fake ultrasound right directly into her face and physically dragged her out the heavy front door by her messy blonde hair. But I spent my entire career orchestrating massive commercial real estate acquisitions and dealing with highly ruthless corporate executives. I knew the best way to destroy a fraud was to let the criminal build their empire as high as possible before pulling the structural pin holding it together. I knew that exposing her fake pregnancy right there in the living room would only cause a massive shouting match and a temporary victory. She would simply find another desperate, toxic lie to manipulate her way out of the absolute disaster. I needed an absolute permanent solution that would completely erase her ability to ever threaten me or any other innocent person ever again in this lifetime. I slowly lowered the glossy medical photograph and placed it gently back onto the glass coffee table. I looked down at my cowardly son, who was still gripping my hands with his pathetic, sweaty palms, completely expecting me to make my final decision. I forced my facial muscles to completely relax entirely, dropping the cold, calculating mask I usually wore. I let out a long, slow sigh, entirely pretending to be deeply emotionally overwhelmed by the sudden, massive family news. I looked directly into Harper's pale blue eyes, and I forced a soft, gentle smile onto my face. I told her that a brand new, innocent baby changes absolutely everything in this world. I told Desmond that I could never possibly throw a high-risk pregnant woman out onto the cold street during the brutal summer heat. I squeezed my son's hands back and announced that the 30-day legal eviction notice was officially completely canceled. Harper let out a massive, loud gasp of pure, absolute relief, entirely falling back against the sofa cushions and crying fresh, fake tears of absolute joy. Desmond jumped up and hugged me tightly, completely, believing he had finally saved his toxic, perfect, fake, aesthetic life. But I immediately held up my hand, completely stopping their massive, premature celebration. I told them that if they were going to permanently stay in my multi-million-dollar luxury estate, we were going to do things my way from now on. I told Harper that she needed to completely revitalize her failing influencer brand right now. I suggested that she host a massive brand launch and baby announcement party right here in my grand luxury estate. I told her she needed to invite absolutely everyone she knew to formally celebrate the new baby and her future success. The sheer absolute greed completely took over Harper's face the exact second I suggested a massive luxury party. The fake tears completely vanished, entirely replaced by a massive, bright, arrogant smile of pure, total victory. She forgot all about her supposedly fragile pregnancy condition and immediately grabbed her cell phone to start planning the massive aesthetic event. She was absolutely thrilled beyond any human comprehension. This was her ultimate dream, completely handed to her on a silver platter. She could finally use my immaculate grand foyer, my pristine gourmet kitchen, and my massive manicured back lawn as the absolute perfect, wealthy background for her failing social media channels. She spent 2 weeks running frantically around my house, planning the most elaborate luxury event this exclusive community had ever seen. She hired expensive boutique caterers to serve delicate finger foods and imported expensive champagne. She ordered massive, towering floral arrangements filled with imported white roses and pink peonies to completely decorate the sweeping grand staircase. She invited over 200 people to my quiet, peaceful home. Her guest list included dozens of highly arrogant lifestyle influencers, multiple wealthy brand sponsors, and powerful corporate marketing executives she desperately wanted to impress. She also made absolutely sure to invite her mother, Meredith, so the two of them could completely gloat over their massive, manipulative victory. Harper was entirely convinced that this massive, highly publicized event would officially secure a massive, lucrative brand sponsorship deal that would finally make her independently wealthy and completely solve all of her massive hidden financial problems. The massive luxury party was going to be the absolute grand finale of her pathetic, fake online existence. She completely spent hours rehearsing her massive emotional speech in front of her expensive ring lights, entirely perfecting every single fake tear and every single dramatic pause. She wanted the entire world to completely believe she was a highly successful, wealthy mother who had absolutely everything perfectly figured out. She walked around my beautiful house, barking loud, demanding orders at the expensive event planners, completely acting like she was the sole wealthy owner of the entire multi-million-dollar estate. She treated my home like her own corporate kingdom, completely unaware she was meticulously decorating her own massive funeral. She bought a brand new, incredibly expensive designer maternity dress, using a fresh line of credit, completely believing her massive financial crimes were entirely buried forever. Desmond strutted around the house with a smug, arrogant smile, completely convinced he had brilliantly saved his family from total, absolute ruin. He thought his massive cowardly lies and his horrific corporate wire fraud were completely safe from the federal authorities. They both truly believed I was just a naive, aging woman who had been completely emotionally manipulated by a fake black and white ultrasound picture. I sat quietly in my formal living room, sipping my warm morning coffee, completely watching them run around my house, preparing for the massive celebration. I smiled warmly at Harper, every single time she walked past me, asking her if she needed any more expensive decorations or any more luxury catering options. I completely funded a portion of the party myself, entirely ensuring the event would be absolutely massive and heavily attended by the most important people in her fake aesthetic world. I wanted absolutely every single person she desperately respected to be standing right inside my massive grand foyer on that specific night. I wanted all the cameras completely rolling and the bright ring lights shining perfectly on her arrogant face. While Harper was busy picking out expensive imported caviar and arranging luxury silk napkins for her massive baby announcement, I was quietly sitting behind the heavy locked mahogany door of my private home office. I opened my encrypted laptop and placed Desmond's old computer next to it. I carefully extracted every single piece of undeniable digital evidence proving their massive corporate embezzlement and severe federal wire fraud. I compiled the forged secondary commercial mortgages, the massive hidden shell company routing numbers, and the exact times Harper illegally transferred the stolen corporate funds to purchase her luxury designer bags. I transferred every single pristine piece of evidence onto a highly secure encrypted external hard drive. I picked up my private cell phone and dialed a highly classified direct number I had kept from my long career in commercial real estate auditing. I called the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division directly. I spoke to a senior federal agent and officially submitted the massive encrypted hard drive containing the absolute undeniable proof of their massive federal felonies. I completely laid out the entire sophisticated corporate embezzlement scheme and provided them with the exact physical location of the two active primary suspects. But I did not just hand over the massive evidence and let the federal authorities dictate the timeline. I coordinated the exact hour of the tactical federal raid. I told the senior federal agent that the absolute best time to catch both suspects completely off guard and entirely secure the premises without any massive physical resistance was this upcoming Saturday evening at exactly 8:00. That was the exact precise moment Harper was scheduled to stand on my sweeping grand staircase and announce her fake pregnancy to her massive wealthy audience. I wanted absolutely every single one of her incredibly wealthy sponsors and her highly arrogant influencer friends to witness the exact moment her entire fraudulent empire completely collapsed into absolute dust. I wanted the cameras completely rolling and the massive bright ring lights fully shining on her face when the heavy front doors were finally violently breached. The absolute trap was finally perfectly set. The highly anticipated Saturday evening finally arrived, and my massive luxury estate was completely transformed into an absolute circus of arrogant wealth and fake social media aesthetics. The sweeping grand driveway was entirely packed with incredibly expensive luxury sports cars and massive black sport utility vehicles. The heavy oak front doors were completely thrown open, welcoming over 200 of the most obnoxious entitled people I had ever seen in my entire life. Harper had completely outdone herself with the stolen corporate funds, ensuring every single detail of her fake brand launch and baby announcement party was absolutely picture perfect for the digital cameras. Massive towering floral arrangements of imported white roses and delicate pink peonies completely lined the imported marble foyer, completely masking the underlying stench of her massive financial crimes. A highly expensive boutique catering team weaved silently through the crowded rooms, carrying silver trays loaded with imported beluga caviar and delicate crystal flutes bubbling with the most expensive vintage champagne available in the city. The house was entirely filled with incredibly wealthy, arrogant lifestyle influencers and highly powerful corporate marketing executives. These were the exact people Harper desperately wanted to impress and manipulate into signing massive, lucrative brand sponsorship deals. They walked around my beautiful, peaceful sanctuary wearing custom designer evening gowns and highly tailored silk suits, completely treating my multi-million-dollar home like it was a rented public event hall. They laughed loudly, taking hundreds of calculated digital photographs under the massive bright ring lights Harper had strategically placed in every single corner of the grand living room. Harper was completely in her absolute element, entirely thriving in the massive fake spotlight she had maliciously manufactured. She descended the grand, sweeping wooden staircase wearing a completely breathtaking custom designer maternity dress that cost more than most people earn in a full calendar year. The expensive pale pink silk draped perfectly over her completely flat stomach, completely selling the massive sociopathic lie of her highly dangerous fake pregnancy. Desmond stood proudly at the bottom of the staircase, wearing a sharp custom-tailored tuxedo, completely playing the role of the highly successful, loving, wealthy husband. He smiled brightly at the flashing cameras, completely ignoring the massive, terrifying reality that his entire life was actively built on severe federal wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement. He held his hand out gently, helping his toxic wife down the final few steps, and the entire crowded room completely erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. Harper completely absorbed the massive validation like a starving animal, entirely feeding her massive, fragile ego with their fake, shallow admiration. She confidently took a sleek silver microphone from the expensive event coordinator and stood perfectly in the center of my grand foyer, entirely surrounded by her wealthy, arrogant friends and her completely broke mother, Meredith. Meredith was standing right in the front row, completely beaming with absolute toxic pride, entirely believing her daughter had permanently legally secured my massive luxury estate for their greedy family. Harper tapped the silver microphone lightly, bringing the loud, bustling room to a complete, absolute hush. She looked around at the sea of wealthy, expectant faces and smiled her absolutely most perfect, highly practiced aesthetic smile. She took a deep, dramatic breath, entirely preparing to deliver the massive, highly emotional speech she had spent 2 weeks meticulously practicing in front of her expensive digital cameras. She welcomed absolutely everyone to her beautiful, perfect home, completely lying effortlessly to the entire crowd of powerful executives. She started talking about her incredibly perfect aesthetic life, her highly successful social media brand, and the massive, beautiful journey of her rapidly growing family. She claimed she and Desmond had worked incredibly hard to build this absolutely perfect, massive sanctuary for their upcoming innocent child. She spoke about traditional family values and the massive importance of maintaining a beautiful, wealthy, peaceful household, completely, entirely ignoring the dark, damp, concrete basement she had been banished to just a few weeks prior. I stood completely quietly in the very back of the massive, crowded living room, entirely hidden in the soft shadows near the large glass patio doors. I was wearing a simple, elegant, dark navy suit, entirely contrasting with the loud, flashy designer gowns filling my home. I held a delicate crystal glass of my favorite dark red wine, taking a slow, calculated sip as I watched this massive, pathetic theatrical performance completely unfold. I was completely perfectly calm, watching the absolute peak of her massive, fraudulent mountain. Harper continued her incredibly fake emotional speech, entirely captivating the shallow audience with her fake tears and her completely fabricated struggles. She talked about the massive challenges of balancing a highly successful digital lifestyle brand while preparing for a high-risk pregnancy. The crowd let out soft, sympathetic sighs, entirely falling for her massive sociopathic manipulation. And then she completely made the absolute biggest massive mistake of her entire pathetic life. She decided she needed to completely publicly assert her ultimate dominance over me in front of her massive wealthy audience. She needed to completely humiliate me to cement her absolute fake ownership of my massive luxury estate. Harper looked directly over the crowd of expensive suits and locked her pale blue eyes entirely on my calm face, standing in the dark shadows. She smiled a completely toxic, malicious smile and gripped the silver microphone tightly. She let out a soft, dramatic chuckle, entirely pretending to be incredibly generous and highly compassionate. She told the massive crowd of influencers that building this perfect, beautiful, wealthy life was not always incredibly easy. She explicitly pointed her manicured finger directly at me, making sure every single camera and every single guest turned their heads to look at me standing quietly in the back of the room. She spoke directly into the microphone, her voice dripping with absolute pure, toxic arrogance and complete fake pity. She stated that taking care of aging, difficult family members was a massive burden, but it was absolutely necessary for a good traditional wife. She laughed loudly, a sharp, grating sound, and announced that my mother-in-law is so incredibly lucky, we graciously let her live with us in our massive, beautiful home. She completely publicly claimed my multi-million-dollar estate as her own and painted me as a pathetic sick charity case they were completely generously supporting. The entire room erupted into soft, polite laughter and supportive murmurs entirely praising her for being such an incredibly kind and highly patient, wealthy daughter-in-law. Meredith turned around and shot me a completely smug, arrogant look of pure, absolute, total victory. Desmond looked down at his expensive leather shoes, completely, entirely refusing to defend his own mother from this massive public humiliation. He just let his toxic wife completely degrade me in front of 200 wealthy, powerful strangers. I did not react at all. I did not flinch or drop my crystal glass. I did not scream or push my way through the massive crowd to publicly correct her massive, pathetic lies. I simply took another slow, elegant sip of my dark red wine and smiled, a completely freezing, cold, terrifying smile directly back at her. I let her enjoy her fake, glorious victory. I let her believe she was the reigning queen of the world. I simply glanced down at the sleek gold watch secured tightly around my left wrist. The thin, delicate hands were slowly ticking forward, entirely approaching the absolute top of the hour. It was exactly 1 minute before 8 o'clock. I knew something she absolutely did not know. I knew that while she was busy publicly insulting me and bragging about her massive stolen wealth, a massive, highly coordinated tactical perimeter had already been completely established around my entire estate. I knew that the heavy metal gates at the bottom of my long private driveway had already been completely quietly secured. I just stood there in the shadows, completely perfectly silent, entirely waiting for the massive, absolute, glorious finale. Harper opened her mouth to continue her pathetic, arrogant speech, but she never got the chance to finish her sentence. The heavy, antique grandfather clock standing in the hallway began to chime loudly, signaling the absolute top of the hour. Suddenly, the massive custom oak front doors of my luxury estate were violently pushed entirely open with an incredibly deafening, massive crash. It was absolutely not the expensive boutique caterers bringing in another tray of warm appetizers. A massive, highly coordinated squad of serious federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers stormed directly into the grand foyer, completely interrupting the pristine aesthetic party. The bold, bright yellow letters spelling out the Federal Bureau of Investigation were printed clearly across their heavy, dark tactical jackets. The lead federal agent stepped aggressively into the center of the completely silent room, holding a thick stack of heavily stamped federal warrants directly in his hand, completely ready to entirely destroy her massive, fraudulent empire. The loud, heavy crash of the massive custom oak doors violently slamming against the pristine imported marble walls completely shattered the fake aesthetic atmosphere of the luxury brand launch party. The soft, elegant classical jazz music playing quietly from the expensive hidden surround sound speakers was instantly and abruptly cut off by a terrified catering manager who completely dropped his entire tray of expensive crystal glasses. The massive grand room, filled with over 200 wealthy, arrogant lifestyle influencers and highly powerful corporate marketing executives, completely froze in absolute sheer terror. Absolutely nobody moved a single inch. The light clinking of expensive crystal champagne flutes and the loud, obnoxious fake laughter completely died instantly, entirely replacing the joyful, celebratory noise with a heavy, suffocating, deeply terrified silence. A massive, highly coordinated tactical squad of serious federal agents, wearing dark, heavy protective windbreakers, swarmed directly into my grand foyer, moving with absolute precise military efficiency. They immediately and completely blocked every single possible exit in the massive luxury estate, standing firmly in front of the heavy glass patio doors, the side kitchen entrances, and the sweeping grand front entrance. The incredibly wealthy guests gasped loudly, completely, dropping their expensive imported caviar appetizers directly onto my pristine hardwood floors. They instantly recognized the bright yellow bold letters spelling out the Federal Bureau of Investigation, printed boldly across the backs of the heavy, dark tactical jackets. The lead federal agent, a tall, highly imposing man with a completely stern, unyielding expression, walked aggressively straight through the massive, dense crowd of expensive designer evening gowns and custom-tailored silk suits. The entire sea of arrogant influencers completely parted for him, entirely terrified of being accidentally legally associated with whatever massive federal crime was currently unfolding right in front of their eyes. The lead agent marched directly up to the absolute center of the grand foyer, where Harper was standing completely frozen in absolute sheer panic. Her pale blue eyes were massively wide, with pure, unadulterated terror, completely staring at the thick, heavy stack of legally stamped federal warrants gripped tightly in his large hands. The sleek silver microphone she had just used to publicly humiliate me and entirely fabricate her fake high-risk pregnancy was still gripped tightly in her shaking, pale fingers. The lead agent did not politely ask for permission to speak or interrupt her massive fake speech. He reached out and forcefully snatched the expensive silver microphone directly out of her trembling hand. He turned his stern face toward the massive crowd of completely silent, terrified influencers and powerful brand sponsors. He tapped the microphone once, and his deep, powerful, booming voice completely echoed through the entire massive luxury estate. He looked directly at Harper and Desmond and officially announced their absolute, total, massive destruction. He stated loudly and clearly over the microphone that he was formally executing a massive federal arrest warrant issued directly by the United States Department of Justice. The lead agent read the massive, severe criminal charges aloud for every single wealthy guest and powerful corporate marketing executive to hear perfectly clearly. He announced that Harper and Desmond were formally being placed under immediate federal arrest for severe, massive corporate embezzlement, systemic federal wire fraud, and massive aggravated identity theft. He detailed exactly how they had actively forged secondary commercial mortgages to completely steal millions of dollars from a legitimate corporate property management firm to fund their pathetic fake online lifestyle. The collective gasp of pure horror from the massive crowd of 200 guests was absolutely deafening. Every single powerful brand sponsor and wealthy influencer immediately pulled out their expensive smartphones, completely turning their high-definition cameras directly onto Harper, completely recording her massive, humiliating downfall in real time. The absolute terrifying reality of the massive, severe federal charges finally completely crashed down upon Harper, delicate, fake aesthetic reality. The smug, arrogant smile she had proudly worn all evening completely vanished entirely, replaced by a twisted, ugly mask of absolute, pure panic and utter, sheer desperation. She began to scream completely hysterically at the top of her lungs, flailing her thin arms wildly and completely ruining her incredibly expensive custom designer maternity dress. She screamed directly into the stern faces of the federal agents, entirely claiming that this was a massive, horrible misunderstanding and a complete, terrible mistake made by the banks. She completely dropped her fragile, high-risk pregnant woman act, jumping up and down and violently demanding that they immediately leave her beautiful, perfect, aesthetic house. She cried massive, heavy tears, entirely pleading with her wealthy influencer friends and her lucrative brand sponsors to completely believe her and fiercely protect her fake digital empire from these false accusations. But her wealthy fake friends completely took massive steps backward, entirely disgusted and completely terrified of the severe federal wire fraud charges. They did not want to be anywhere near a massive federal criminal and risk their own lucrative brand deals. Standing perfectly frozen in the very front row of the massive crowd, Meredith completely realized the absolute horrifying truth. She watched the heavy tactical federal agents completely surround her precious daughter, and the dark reality of her own massive impending financial ruin entirely snapped her fragile, arrogant mind. Meredith completely lost her entire sanity in that exact moment. She wildly looked around the massive, crowded room, completely searching for a convenient scapegoat to entirely blame for her massive family failure. Her crazed, frantic eyes suddenly locked directly onto my completely calm face, standing peacefully in the dark shadows near the back patio doors. Meredith let out a loud, feral, completely blood-curdling scream of pure toxic rage. She completely lunged forward, entirely attempting to physically attack me and violently claw my calm face in front of the entire party. She screamed loudly, claiming that I had maliciously set them up and completely ruined her perfect, beautiful daughter life because I was a deeply jealous, vindictive old woman. She did not even make it 3 steps across the expensive imported marble floor. A massive, heavy tactical federal agent immediately stepped aggressively directly into her chaotic path. He forcefully tackled Meredith violently, bringing her down hard onto the cold marble floor and instantly entirely restraining her aggressive, toxic behavior. He loudly warned her that any further physical aggression would result in her immediate federal arrest for violently assaulting an officer and completely obstructing justice. While Meredith was being violently held down on the cold floor, Desmond entirely broke under the massive, terrifying federal pressure. The cowardly boy I had completely raised to be a strong, honest man completely reverted to a pathetic, terrified, sniveling child. The exact second he saw the heavy, cold steel federal handcuffs being pulled out of the dark tactical windbreakers, Desmond completely shattered. He did not step forward to fiercely protect his toxic, manipulative wife. He did not stand bravely by the woman he had completely thrown his own loving mother away to fiercely defend. Desmond immediately dropped heavily onto his knees, right in the absolute middle of the grand foyer, completely sobbing hysterically and entirely begging the stern federal agents for absolute mercy. He raised a shaking, terrified hand and aggressively pointed his trembling finger directly at Harper. He completely threw his wife under the massive federal bus without a single second of absolute hesitation or marital loyalty. He screamed loudly at the top of his lungs, entirely telling the federal agents that Harper was the absolute sole evil mastermind behind the entire massive corporate embezzlement scheme. He cried heavy, pathetic tears, entirely claiming that she had viciously forced him to steal the massive corporate funds and actively manipulated him into committing severe federal wire fraud just to buy her expensive designer handbags and fully fund her completely fake aesthetic online lifestyle. He screamed that he was just a highly abused, innocent victim and completely begged them not to send him to a dark, terrifying federal prison. Harper looked down at her completely pathetic, sobbing husband, her pale blue eyes completely filled with absolute pure betrayal and entirely total shock. Their absolutely perfect fake aesthetic marriage was entirely crumbling into absolute toxic dust right in front of 200 recording digital cameras. The lead federal agent completely ignored Desmond, pathetic, dramatic sobbing, and Harper entirely hysterical shrieking. He gestured aggressively to his highly trained tactical squad, and 2 massive federal agents stepped completely forward, grabbing Harper roughly by her thin, shaking arms. They violently twisted her hands completely behind her back, entirely ignoring her loud, desperate protests and her entirely fake, high-risk pregnancy claims. The sharp, loud, metallic click of the heavy, cold steel police handcuffs locking tightly around her pale wrists echoed completely brightly over the massive, chaotic noise of the entire massive room. She was entirely, officially, and permanently trapped, completely stripped of her massive fake wealth and her highly arrogant digital lifestyle. I slowly stepped entirely out of the dark, comforting shadows, walking completely calmly and incredibly powerfully across my pristine hardwood floor. The massive crowd of terrified wealthy influencers and totally shocked corporate executives completely parted for me, entirely creating a wide, clear, respectful path directly toward the absolute center of the grand foyer. I walked straight up to Harper, who was currently completely securely restrained by the massive tactical federal agents. Her pale blue eyes looked up at me completely filled with absolute sheer terror and entirely total pathetic defeat. She finally completely realized that the quiet, retired older woman she had maliciously tried to illegally evict and severely medically gaslight had completely masterminded her absolute total federal destruction. I stopped perfectly directly in front of her, completely looking down at her pathetic, crying, ruined face with an absolutely freezing cold, terrifying smile of complete triumph. I did not raise my voice or scream with massive unhinged anger. I kept my tone incredibly quiet, completely deadly, and entirely perfectly clear for her to hear every single word over the loud sobbing of her completely ruined mother and cowardly husband. Remember when you boldly stood in my own beautiful kitchen and told me I could only eat the leftover scraps after your family was completely done eating? I asked her, my voice dripping with absolute, pure, unadulterated final victory. I leaned slightly forward entirely, watching the absolute, pure, massive horror completely register deeply in her wide, terrified eyes. Well, prison food absolutely does not have a special aesthetic VIP line for fake wealthy influencers, I whispered coldly right into her ear. Enjoy completely starving in your cold concrete cell. 48 hours after the spectacular federal raid completely destroyed their pathetic fake aesthetic lifestyle, the harsh, cold reality of the federal justice system completely crushed whatever remaining arrogance Harper and Desmond still possessed. They were no longer sitting comfortably in my multi-million-dollar luxury estate demanding that I eat their leftover scraps. They were both currently locked inside separate freezing cold concrete federal holding cells in the downtown district, completely stripped of their expensive custom-tailored designer clothing and entirely stripped of their massive false pride. They were wearing standard-issue bright orange federal jumpsuits and sleeping on paper-thin mattresses, completely surrounded by thick steel bars and the deafening noise of the crowded federal detention center. The absolute sheer panic of facing massive decades in a federal prison completely destroyed any lingering romantic loyalty they had left for each other. In their separate interrogation rooms, they were aggressively and violently turning on each other, completely desperate to save their own pathetic lives. Desmond sat in his cold metal chair weeping hysterically and entirely blaming his toxic wife for absolutely everything. He told the federal investigators that Harper had viciously manipulated his entire mind, completely forced him to forge the secondary commercial mortgages, and entirely controlled all of the massive stolen corporate funds. He painted himself as a completely innocent, terrified hostage, completely trapped in an abusive aesthetic marriage. Meanwhile, right down the dark concrete hallway, Harper was screaming at the top of her lungs, completely throwing her cowardly husband directly under the massive federal bus. She told the severe tactical agents that she was just a naive, innocent social media influencer and completely blamed Desmond for masterminding the entire sophisticated corporate embezzlement scheme. She lied through her teeth, entirely claiming she absolutely never knew the massive amounts of money flowing into her shell company accounts were completely stolen from his corporate property management firm. They completely tore each other apart entirely, proving that their fake, perfect online marriage was absolutely nothing more than a shallow, toxic criminal partnership built entirely on massive greed and absolute total delusion. While they were busy desperately destroying each other inside the dark federal holding facility, the massive digital empire Harper had spent years maliciously building was entirely burning to the ground out in the real world. The explosive viral video of the massive federal tactical raid at her luxury brand launch party had completely saturated every single major social media platform. The entire world watched the arrogant, wealthy influencer get violently handcuffed and dragged out of my beautiful grand foyer, screaming completely hysterically in her expensive custom maternity dress. The massive public backlash was incredibly swift and absolutely entirely merciless. Every single one of her highly lucrative brand sponsors completely panicked, entirely terrified of the massive, severe wire fraud charges. They immediately completely dropped her, entirely severing all of their expensive corporate contracts and completely publicly denouncing her highly toxic behavior. They released massive official statements completely distancing their wealthy corporations from her massive criminal enterprise. But the absolute final devastating blow to her fragile fake aesthetic ego came directly from the social media platforms themselves. Because the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially confirmed that she had actively used stolen corporate funds to illegally purchase millions of fake automated bot followers to artificially inflate her digital engagement, the massive technology companies completely intervened. They permanently and entirely suspended every single one of her highly lucrative social media accounts, completely citing severe systemic fraudulent activity and massive community violations. When Harper eventually gets out of her cold, concrete federal holding cell, she will have absolutely no digital platform left to ever return to in her entire life. Her 2 million fake followers were entirely erased from the internet in a single instant, entirely reducing her massive fake digital kingdom to absolute total digital dust. She was entirely officially a complete nobody. While the arrogant criminals completely suffered the massive, horrific consequences of their own toxic actions, I was sitting perfectly calm and entirely composed inside a highly sterile white federal interview room. I was sitting at a cold steel table completely alone, waiting for the massive federal machine to process my official witness testimony. The heavy metal door violently swung open, and a tall, incredibly arrogant man, wearing an expensive custom-tailored gray suit, completely swaggered into the small room. He slammed his heavy leather briefcase aggressively onto the steel table, completely attempting to physically intimidate me with his sudden, loud entrance. He sat down heavily in the metal chair directly across from me, flashing a highly predatory, completely toxic fake smile. He introduced himself as the highly expensive senior defense attorney currently representing my cowardly son. He looked at me with absolute sheer condescension, completely believing I was just a naive, aging mother who could be easily manipulated and totally bullied into protecting her only child from a massive federal prison sentence. He leaned aggressively across the cold steel table, completely invading my quiet personal space, and lowered his voice into a dark, threatening whisper. He told me that Desmond was completely ready to accept a minor plea deal, but the entire federal case heavily relied on my incredibly damaging personal testimony regarding the forged medical documents and the massive fake Alzheimer's diagnosis. He told me that I needed to immediately, formally, completely drop all of my severe criminal accusations against my own flesh and blood. He stated that if I completely refused to cooperate and entirely insisted on testifying against Desmond in a public federal courtroom, I would be completely destroying my own family legacy forever. He tried to completely weaponize my deep maternal instincts entirely, claiming that a good, loyal mother would absolutely never send her only precious son to rot in a dark, terrifying federal prison cell just to prove a petty personal point. He entirely ordered me to completely retract my official federal statements immediately and entirely blame Harper for the absolute entire massive fraudulent operation. I sat perfectly still, completely listening to this incredibly arrogant, highly expensive corporate defense lawyer completely attempt to entirely bully a retired commercial real estate investor. I did not shed a single tear, and I absolutely did not flinch under his highly toxic, threatening gaze. I looked completely dead into his arrogant, cold eyes, and I smiled my absolutely, completely freezing cold, highly terrifying signature smile. I told him he had completely and entirely miscalculated exactly who he was attempting to legally threaten today. I absolutely refused to drop a single criminal charge or entirely retract a single word of my highly damaging official federal testimony. I reached completely calmly into my dark navy suit jacket pocket and slowly pulled out a thick, heavily officially notarized legal document. I slid the thick, heavy paper completely smoothly across the cold steel table, entirely stopping it right perfectly in front of his highly expensive, arrogant hands. I completely, legally, completely, officially, and permanently disowned Desmond entirely, right there in that highly sterile, cold, federal interview room. I told the entirely shocked defense lawyer that Desmond was absolutely no longer my son, and he would absolutely never see a single shiny penny of my massive multi-million-dollar estate ever again in his entirely pathetic, cowardly life. But I absolutely did not completely stop there. I reached back into my deep jacket pocket and completely pulled out one final, absolutely devastating piece of highly classified, undeniable physical evidence. I threw a small encrypted digital flash drive aggressively onto the cold steel table right next to the massive, heavy legal disownment papers. I told the highly expensive, arrogant defense lawyer that before my tactical federal agents violently raided my massive luxury estate, I had completely hacked entirely deeply into Desmond private, highly encrypted hidden email servers. I told him that digital flash drive contained undeniable, absolute concrete proof that Desmond had already secretly entirely purchased a highly expensive one-way international first-class plane ticket to a massive non-extradition country entirely located in South America. The digital timeline proved completely undeniably that Desmond had actively entirely planned to completely quietly flee the United States tomorrow morning, entirely leaving his completely toxic pregnant wife completely behind to completely take the absolute entire massive federal fall for the whole massive corporate embezzlement scheme. I watched the blood entirely, completely, totally drain from the highly arrogant, expensive defense lawyer pale face, entirely realizing his completely pathetic, cowardly client was an absolute massive active federal flight risk. He knew instantly that no judge in the entire country would ever grant bail to a man caught actively trying to permanently escape the severe federal justice system. I leaned slightly forward, perfectly maintaining my absolutely freezing cold, triumphant smile, entirely watching his entire massive legal strategy completely crumble into absolute pathetic total dust. You can completely tell my former son that I absolutely look completely forward to perfectly destroying him permanently in public federal court next month, I whispered. Exactly 3 months slowly passed since the massive tactical federal raid completely destroyed the fake aesthetic lifestyle of my former son and his highly toxic, manipulative wife. The highly anticipated federal criminal trial finally officially began in the massive downtown federal courthouse. The heavy mahogany doors of the massive public courtroom were entirely sealed shut, blocking out the huge crowd of angry media reporters and furious former brand sponsors. Harper and Desmond sat completely separated at 2 incredibly distinct heavy wooden defense tables, refusing to even look at each other. They were entirely stripped of their incredibly expensive clothes today. They were forcefully ordered to wear highly standard bright orange federal prison jumpsuits. The heavy cold steel chains completely binding their pale wrists and ankles clinked incredibly loudly against the pristine, polished marble floor every single time they nervously shifted in their hard wooden chairs. The incredibly arrogant, high-priced defense lawyer representing Harper stood completely up from his heavy table, entirely preparing to deliver his massive opening statement to the completely silent, attentive jury. He desperately attempted to paint his highly toxic, manipulative client as a completely innocent, incredibly naive, young traditional wife who was violently, heavily coerced today. He claimed she was entirely forced into participating in the massive, severe corporate embezzlement scheme. He paced incredibly slowly across the highly polished courtroom floor, entirely pointing his expensive gold pen directly at Desmond, sitting completely pathetically at the opposite defense table. The arrogant defense lawyer loudly told the highly attentive federal jury that Harper was entirely financially dependent on her completely older, highly experienced corporate executive husband. He entirely lied through his perfectly white teeth, completely claiming that she had absolutely zero fundamental knowledge of the highly complex secondary commercial mortgages or the massive illegal routing transit numbers today. He completely painted Harper as a deeply fragile, highly innocent victim who simply completely trusted her wealthy husband to entirely manage the massive family finances. He told the highly sympathetic-looking jury that the massive hundreds of thousands of dollars completely spent on her entirely fake luxury designer wardrobe were simply incredibly generous, loving gifts from a highly successful corporate husband. He completely, totally ignored the massive, undeniable reality that she had actively, maliciously forged his highly secure executive signatures and entirely orchestrated the massive, fraudulent shell companies herself to entirely fund her massive lies and arrogant aesthetic lifestyle now. Harper sat incredibly perfectly still at her heavy wooden defense table, completely keeping her pale blue eyes entirely cast down toward her lap. She completely forced massive fake tears to roll incredibly slowly down her pale cheeks, entirely attempting to completely manipulate the highly attentive federal jury into feeling massive, profound pity for her completely pathetic fake situation. She was playing the absolute ultimate victim card, entirely hoping her fake white tears would magically erase her massive, severe federal felonies. But her incredibly expensive, arrogant defense lawyer completely made one absolute massive mistake in his pathetic, desperate defense strategy indeed. He completely forgot that the highly powerful lead federal prosecutor had an absolute massive, undeniably potent secret weapon waiting incredibly patiently right outside the massive, heavy wooden courtroom doors. I was sitting completely perfectly calm inside the quiet, sterile witness waiting room, entirely prepared to absolutely destroy her completely fake, innocent, traditional wife narrative. The heavy wooden door finally swung entirely open, and the federal bailiff officially called my absolute name. I completely smoothed the soft, expensive fabric of my highly tailored dark navy suit, entirely walking straight into the bright courtroom with pure, confident energy and total grace now. I walked powerfully across the pristine, polished marble floor, completely ignoring the massive sea of highly attentive reporters, and directly approached the massive wooden witness stand. I completely raised my right hand and entirely formally swore to tell the absolute, complete, undeniable truth. The lead federal prosecutor, a highly brilliant, incredibly sharp woman, approached the massive wooden stand, completely ready to entirely dismantle the massive, pathetic defense strategy. I sat completely, perfectly still, looking entirely dead into Harper wide, completely terrified, pale blue eyes, entirely letting her know her massive, fraudulent empire was absolutely, completely over in this courtroom today. The federal prosecutor completely methodically walked me through the absolute massive mountain of undeniable physical evidence I had completely gathered. I delivered a completely brutal, highly calculated, and entirely fact-based testimony that completely destroyed every single massive, pathetic lie her expensive defense attorney had completely spun. I explicitly detailed exactly how I had completely discovered the massive, incredibly severe corporate wire fraud entirely hidden deep inside my completely cowardly former son's discarded silver laptop. I described discovering the massive forged secondary commercial mortgages entirely created using his massive secure executive digital signatures to fund her highly pathetic, lavish life. I formally testified that Harper was absolutely not a completely naive, highly innocent traditional wife entirely manipulated by her wealthy husband. I completely proved she was the absolute, cold, highly calculating, evil mastermind completely driving the entire massive corporate embezzlement scheme. I looked directly at the highly attentive federal jury and entirely exposed her massive, terrifying, sociopathic manipulation, completely detailing the absolutely horrific, massive fake Alzheimer's disease plot. I entirely testified that she had completely maliciously and actively bribed a highly corrupt medical doctor to entirely falsely diagnose me today, simply to steal my beautiful grand luxury estate home entirely. I absolutely testified that she actively planned to legally, officially declare me entirely mentally incompetent and permanently steal my multi-million-dollar luxury estate. The entire massive federal jury audibly gasped in absolute, pure, massive horror as they completely realized the terrifying depth of her completely toxic, pure evil. But I was absolutely not completely finished destroying her massive, fake, fragile reality. I reached into my dark navy suit pocket and proudly produced the absolutely final, most totally, incredibly devastating piece of completely undeniable physical evidence to the completely silent courtroom today, ending her entire fake aesthetic manipulation forever entirely. I carefully handed the glossy black and white medical ultrasound photograph directly to the highly brilliant federal prosecutor. I explicitly testified that Harper had completely, actively, maliciously faked a highly dangerous, massive pregnancy entirely using her completely broke mother, massive old medical records entirely attempting to permanently stop a completely legally binding 30-day massive property eviction notice. I completely pointed my steady, confident finger directly at Harper. Incredibly pale, absolutely terrified face, publicly officially declaring her an absolutely total, pathetic, malicious monster who manipulated the beautiful sacred concept of motherhood to entirely avoid massive federal prison felony charges today. The incredibly arrogant, expensive corporate defense attorney absolutely tried to aggressively cross-examine my perfectly rock-solid testimony, but I absolutely effortlessly deflected every single pathetic, weak legal trap he attempted to spring. My entire testimony was completely rooted in absolute, undeniable documented financial facts and highly certified digital records, making his entirely pathetic emotional arguments completely, totally irrelevant and incredibly foolish. The heavy criminal trial completely concluded exactly 2 weeks later, after the massive, highly attentive federal jury completely deliberated for absolutely less than 3 total hours. The massive, heavy wooden courtroom doors completely swung absolutely, totally, entirely open. The 12 highly serious federal jurors completely slowly marched directly back into the massive silent public courtroom, entirely holding their absolutely massive, highly official final verdict forms. The incredibly strict federal judge, a massive, imposing older man, entirely demanded absolute, complete, total silence. The jury officially delivered a massive, completely unanimous, absolute guilty verdict on every single massive, severe federal felony charge. The strict federal judge absolutely glared down at Harper and Desmond from his massive, high, heavy, solid wooden, absolute mahogany official courtroom legal bench, ready to entirely, perfectly, completely, aggressively, permanently punish their massive, toxic, pathetic greed today. He absolutely stated he was utterly, completely, totally disgusted by their massive, incredibly pure, sociopathic, completely greedy, toxic criminal behavior. He officially, absolutely, heavily, severely sentenced Harper to entirely serve exactly 8 long, hard, agonizing years, completely inside a dark, cold, highly secure federal prison facility without any possible early parole. He then entirely, heavily, officially sentenced Desmond to serve exactly 5 long years inside a completely separate, incredibly massive, highly dangerous federal penitentiary, officially punishing his massive cowardice. The heavy sound of his wooden gavel completely echoed like a massive, satisfying, beautiful musical chord through the silent room entirely. But the absolute, massive, complete, satisfying, ultimate legal payoff finally, completely, magically happened right exactly before the massive, highly heavy official courtroom completely officially adjourned. The highly strict federal judge absolutely, entirely, officially ordered that every single remaining massive physical asset officially belonging to Harper be absolutely, immediately seized. He entirely, absolutely, officially, permanently ordered her massive remaining assets entirely liquidated to completely repay the stolen corporate funds back to the rightful owners. Harper let out a completely massive, horrifying, absolutely blood-curdling scream, entirely realizing she was absolutely, perfectly, legally, incredibly, totally, completely, fundamentally, entirely, totally, financially, completely ruined forever. The heavy slam of this massive wooden gavel inside the federal courtroom did not simply send Harper and Desmond to a dark, cold federal prison cell entirely surrounded by bars. It entirely triggered a massive, catastrophic financial avalanche that completely destroyed every single remaining piece of their highly arrogant, toxic, racist family, leaving them absolutely, fundamentally, entirely, and permanently ruined. The strict federal judge had officially ordered the immediate total liquidation of every single remaining physical asset tied to Harper and her massive fraudulent influencer brand right in the court. That highly specific legal order completely included the massive fraudulent business loans she had maliciously taken out to initially launch her entirely fake digital empire and pay for her clothes. Harper was legally bankrupt and entirely locked away inside a highly secure federal penitentiary, leaving a massive trail of incredibly severe financial destruction entirely in her pathetic, extremely selfish wake. But the massive, completely poetic justice truly finally arrived exactly 2 weeks after the highly publicized federal criminal trial completely officially concluded inside the massive, highly secure downtown federal courthouse. While I was peacefully sitting inside my beautiful grand luxury estate, entirely enjoying my hot morning coffee, my private real estate attorney completely happily called me with the absolutely massive glorious news, confirming their entire absolute total permanent financial ruin. He told me that Meredith, the incredibly arrogant, deeply racist woman who had boldly stood right inside my pristine marble foyer and completely called my family ghetto, was absolutely, officially, entirely, completely, totally, and fundamentally legally, financially, completely ruined forever. When Harper originally started her pathetic, fake aesthetic influencer brand years ago, she absolutely did not have any legitimate credit history or any real corporate financial backing to use today. She desperately needed a massive influx of initial cash to completely fund her highly expensive designer wardrobe and completely buy her massive initial fake digital following to fool internet users. Because she was absolutely, completely desperate, she convinced her highly arrogant mother to entirely officially co-sign on incredibly massive high-interest corporate business loans using her house as massive collateral. Meredith entirely believed her precious, perfect, beautiful daughter was an absolute digital genius, so she completely happily signed the heavy, legally binding bank documents, entirely leveraging her own massive suburban house as the absolute primary physical collateral for the loans. She completely tied her entire arrogant, fake high society life directly to a massive, highly unstable, fraudulent house of entirely fake digital cards, completely built on absolute lies and deception. When the massive federal tactical raid completely destroyed Harper, and the federal judge entirely ordered the complete liquidation of all her assets, the incredibly ruthless corporate banks immediately, completely aggressively came directly after the primary loan cosigner for immediate payment. Meredith was already drowning in incredibly massive hidden credit card debt and severely behind on her own massive expensive primary mortgage payments, completely entirely ignoring her massive growing financial crisis. When the massive corporate banks entirely aggressively completely demanded the immediate total repayment of the massive fraudulent business loans, Meredith completely, absolutely snapped under the intense, crushing, heavy financial pressure. She had absolutely no hidden cash reserves, and her highly wealthy, arrogant country club friends permanently abandoned her the exact second the massive federal wire fraud scandal became completely public knowledge, entirely, completely destroying her fake high society massive reputation. She was entirely, completely isolated and fundamentally, entirely, totally broke. The incredibly ruthless corporate banks completely, entirely, legally foreclosed on her massive, beautiful suburban home exactly 48 hours after the final massive federal payment demand officially, entirely, completely expired. The incredibly arrogant, toxic woman who had completely, entirely threatened to sue me for an illegal self-help eviction was absolutely, officially, legally, forcefully, completely evicted from her very own massive, beautiful property by highly armed local county sheriffs today. She was completely, entirely stripped of her expensive designer clothing, her highly arrogant, toxic fake pride, and her completely, entirely massive false social status, entirely, completely, permanently, completely destroyed. Forever. The incredibly arrogant, deeply racist family who had entirely, completely, maliciously plotted to steal my beautiful grand luxury estate and permanently lock me away inside a dirty, cheap nursing home was absolutely, entirely left, completely, fundamentally destitute, and entirely, officially, completely homeless, wandering the cold city streets looking for shelter. They absolutely, completely lost absolutely every single thing they ever completely, entirely valued in this entire, completely massive world entirely. While Meredith was completely, entirely forced to aggressively pack her cheap cardboard boxes and completely, entirely move into a tiny, dirty, cheap apartment complex entirely located on the absolute wrong side of the city. Desmond was completely, slowly adjusting to his massive, terrifying, absolute, horrific new reality behind steel bars. He was completely, entirely locked inside a massive, highly dangerous, cold federal penitentiary, entirely surrounded by incredibly violent, severe federal criminals who completely, absolutely did not care about his massive, fake corporate executive background or his highly arrogant fake wife. He was absolutely entirely stripped of his custom-tailored expensive silk suits and completely forced to wear a scratchy, bright orange heavy federal prison uniform. Every single, incredibly agonizing, completely, absolutely terrifying day, entirely, completely surrounded by incredibly dangerous inmates. The incredibly cowardly, pathetic boy I had completely raised and absolutely, entirely financially supported. His entire pathetic life was completely, entirely, absolutely, totally reduced to a highly terrified, completely, entirely pathetic, completely broken federal inmate number, permanently locked away. Completely. Exactly 1 month after he was completely, entirely, officially transferred to the massive, dark, terrifying federal prison facility, my private secure cell phone began to loudly ring while I was peacefully reading a book inside my beautiful, quiet, formal living room, completely enjoying the absolutely, completely, perfectly peaceful, silent house. I slowly looked completely down at the bright, glowing digital screen and absolutely, entirely, immediately recognized the completely, highly specific automated federal prison facility phone number, completely calling my private secure line, interrupting my entirely peaceful, perfectly quiet, amazing afternoon. I completely, entirely, absolutely knew exactly who was desperately waiting on the absolute other end of the cold, heavy, secure federal phone line today, hoping to completely manipulate my emotions. I slowly placed my book entirely gently down onto the glass coffee table and completely calmly, entirely, answered the secure phone, completely pressing the green digital button with my steady hand, completely, perfectly prepared for the entirely, totally pathetic conversation. A highly robotic, loud, automated voice completely officially announced that I was entirely receiving a highly secure collect call directly from a registered federal inmate and completely asked me to entirely officially accept the massive charges to connect the line. I completely quietly pressed the absolute correct digital button and entirely, completely, patiently waited for him to finally entirely speak. The incredibly heavy sound of Desmond, completely pathetic, loud, highly desperate, entirely hysterical sobbing completely, instantly filled my quiet, peaceful, beautiful, grand, luxury estate living room, echoing loudly and pathetically. He was completely crying, absolutely hysterically, entirely begging me to completely, entirely, absolutely, officially forgive his massive, horrific, incredibly toxic criminal actions that entirely, completely destroyed his entire pathetic life. He loudly cried, entirely claiming that he was absolutely, entirely, completely suffering inside the cold, dark, terrifying federal prison cell, and completely begged me to immediately electronically transfer massive amounts of money directly into his incredibly empty federal prison commissary account today, completely whining like a highly, entirely helpless child. He completely, desperately pleaded with me, claiming he absolutely, entirely, completely needed the massive funds to simply buy basic warm socks and highly decent edible food because the standard federal prison meals were absolutely, completely, entirely horrible and incredibly disgusting. He cried entirely, saying he was completely, absolutely, incredibly, deeply, entirely, completely, absolutely sorry for everything he had completely, entirely, absolutely, maliciously done to me, entirely begging for my forgiveness. He begged me to completely, entirely remember that he was absolutely, entirely still my completely precious only son, and entirely pleaded with me to completely visit him inside the dark, terrifying federal prison facility, so we could completely, officially, absolutely, perfectly rebuild our completely shattered family relationship entirely, completely, forever. I sat perfectly, completely still, entirely sitting on my plush velvet sofa, completely, entirely listening to his absolute, pathetic, desperate, hysterical crying, completely fill my quiet, beautiful, peaceful, absolutely massive, entirely safe luxury estate, entirely refusing to completely, absolutely speak. I absolutely, entirely, completely did not shed a single heavy emotional tear, and I completely, absolutely did not feel a single tiny ounce of massive, motherly, absolute compassion for the completely toxic, cowardly, pathetic criminal, currently sobbing on the entirely secure phone line today, completely begging for my hard money. I completely, entirely, absolutely let him, completely, entirely, absolutely cry and entirely, completely beg for exactly 3 long, incredibly silent, absolutely, entirely satisfying minutes, completely enjoying his absolutely pathetic misery. I wanted him to completely, entirely, absolutely, fundamentally realize the absolute, total, massive, horrific depth of his completely, entirely, absolutely massive, incredibly severe betrayal before I entirely, absolutely, totally responded. When he finally completely ran out of heavy breath and entirely paused his pathetic, desperate crying, completely waiting for my warm, loving, motherly, highly forgiving, absolute response, I completely, entirely, absolutely, totally made my absolutely final, completely, totally official, permanent family decision, completely, entirely, absolutely ending the massive toxic connection. I absolutely, completely, entirely did not say a single, completely solitary, absolute word to him, completely, entirely ignoring his pathetic, absolutely, completely, entirely desperate, massive pleading, entirely, completely, incredibly coldly. I completely, entirely, calmly pulled the phone away and absolutely pressed the red button, completely, entirely blocking his number forever. Exactly 1 entire year has passed since the massive, heavy, tactical federal raid completely removed the dark, toxic cloud from my beautiful, grand luxury estate. The massive sweeping driveway is completely empty of any flashy rented sports cars, and the grand imported marble foyer is perfectly peaceful. I wake up every single morning in my massive primary master suite surrounded by absolute pure tranquility and the warm, bright sunlight streaming gently through my expensive custom silk curtains. There is absolutely no screaming coming from the dark, damp basement, and there are absolutely no highly arrogant lifestyle influencers pacing my pristine hardwood floors, aggressively demanding high-speed wireless internet. I completely reclaimed every single square inch of my multi-million-dollar sanctuary, and I entirely purged absolutely every single tiny trace of my cowardly former son and his completely sociopathic fake wealthy wife. The very first thing I absolutely did after the strict federal judge officially permanently sentenced them to massive decades in a cold, dark federal prison was completely remodel the massive basement. I absolutely refused to let that physical space hold the horrific, toxic memories of their pathetic, greedy entitlement. I hired a highly expensive private luxury contractor team to completely gut the entire dark concrete space, removing the cheap, temporary clothing racks and the dirty, dusty storage bins where Desmond carelessly hid his highly encrypted stolen silver corporate laptop. I instructed the professional luxury builders to entirely transform the massive, cold, dark concrete room into a pristine, incredibly beautiful temperature-controlled custom wine cellar, fully stocked with the finest rare international vintages, and a massive, highly luxurious private home theater system, completely featuring massive leather reclining seats and a highly advanced cinematic projector screen. The dark, damp walls were entirely replaced with rich, warm mahogany wood paneling, and the cold, hard concrete floor was covered in highly expensive plush imported carpeting that feels incredibly soft under my bare feet. There is absolutely no pathetic, lingering energy of Harper, hysterical fake crying, or Desmond cowardly, massive sniveling anywhere in my massive, beautiful house today. They are absolutely permanently erased from my massive daily life, completely replaced by absolute pure joy and complete total peace. I spend my quiet, beautiful mornings peacefully sipping my hot, fresh premium coffee on my massive shaded back patio, listening to the beautiful, soft sounds of the singing birds and the gentle rustling leaves. I look out over my perfectly manicured green lawn, and I feel an overwhelming, deep, profound sense of absolute, pure victory. I spent 30 incredibly long, agonizing, highly stressful years aggressively dominating the highly ruthless commercial real estate market, entirely building my massive multi-million-dollar empire from the absolute dirt up completely by myself. I refused to let a highly arrogant, deeply racist, toxic, manipulative little girl and my completely cowardly, pathetic, spineless former son illegally steal the massive, beautiful, peaceful kingdom I rightfully built with my own blood, sweat, and massive tears. I am completely safe, and my beautiful house is officially my absolutely own private, peaceful sanctuary once again. I walk through my grand hallways, running my hands over the incredibly expensive custom-imported artwork and the perfectly polished antique wooden furniture. Every single room in this massive luxury estate completely radiates with incredibly warm, bright, positive energy now. I completely threw away absolutely every single tiny physical item that even slightly remotely reminded me of their toxic, arrogant existence in my peaceful life. I replaced the heavy antique mahogany record stand that Harper completely maliciously, violently destroyed in her absolute massive, pathetic, toxic, jealous rage. I actively sourced highly rare, beautiful vintage original vinyl records to entirely rebuild my late husband. Massive, beautiful, incredible music collection piece by beautiful piece, completely honoring his incredible legacy. The incredibly rich, warm, soulful, beautiful music entirely fills my massive grand living room once again, completely washing away the terrible, dark, massive, horrific memories of her massive physical, emotional sabotage. I am completely, fully restored, and my beautiful, massive, perfect luxury estate is completely, incredibly whole again. I breathe in the incredibly fresh, completely clean air of my massive, beautiful, absolutely perfect home and entirely, absolutely smile, completely enjoying my totally peaceful early retirement, knowing I am finally completely, entirely free from their massive, horrible, absolutely toxic, pathetic manipulation forever and ever. Every single day is a beautiful, brand new, completely peaceful, incredibly quiet, absolute total blessing. Total. I do not have to constantly look over my shoulder or lock my private home office doors to protect my confidential corporate financial documents from a greedy, entitled squatter. The massive, heavy anxiety that completely weighed down my tired chest for those horrific 4 months has completely, entirely vanished. I am a strong, wealthy, independent Black woman who completely protected her massive, beautiful legacy. Today is a highly massive, special, beautiful Sunday afternoon, and my pristine, massive gourmet kitchen is completely, fully, incredibly busy once again. But this entirely massive, specific, beautiful Sunday dinner is absolutely, totally, fundamentally different from the absolutely horrific, massively toxic family meal that completely initially started this entire massive legal warfare exactly 1 long year ago. I have completely spent the entire beautiful Sunday morning lovingly cooking a massive, beautiful, traditional, soulful feast. The incredible, rich, savory, beautiful smell of slow-cooked collard greens, incredibly rich, creamy baked macaroni and cheese, and absolutely perfectly seasoned golden smothered chicken entirely fills the entire massive luxury estate. But today, I am absolutely not cooking this massive, beautiful, expensive meal for incredibly toxic, ungrateful, highly manipulative, entitled, cowardly, pathetic people who absolutely view me as a massive, entirely unpaid, invisible domestic servant. Today, my massive, highly polished, grand formal dining table is beautifully set for 12 highly powerful, incredibly strong, deeply loyal, entirely successful women. I completely invited my most highly trusted private corporate business partners, my loyal, supportive, longtime personal friends, and the incredibly brilliant, powerful female federal prosecutor who entirely helped me permanently legally destroy the massive, fraudulent criminal empire. The heavy oak front doors entirely completely swing open, and my massive, pristine imported marble foyer is completely quickly filled with the beautiful, warm, loud, genuine sounds of real, authentic, happy laughter and deep, profound mutual respect. These are completely, entirely, incredibly powerful, successful women who absolutely know my massive, true, deep worth, and who absolutely respect the massive, incredible, completely, absolute, highly difficult journey I completely survived to entirely build my massive, beautiful life. We entirely gather around the massive, beautiful, long, polished wooden formal dining table, completely sharing incredible, joyful stories and pouring incredibly expensive, dark, rich vintage wine from my brand new, beautiful custom basement wine cellar. When the incredibly beautiful, highly expensive, heavy ceramic plates of warm, delicious, perfectly cooked food are finally entirely placed onto the massive, beautiful dining table, the entire massive room completely falls incredibly respectfully quiet. There is absolutely no arrogant, entitled, white lifestyle influencer standing aggressively entirely blocking my hot stove or completely demanding that I only eat the cold, completely forgotten, pathetic leftover scraps today. I completely, entirely stand incredibly proudly at the very absolute complete head of my massive, beautiful, formal dining table, completely looking out at the beautiful faces of the amazing, loyal women completely surrounding me. I completely, entirely pick up the heavy silver antique serving spoon and I entirely, deliberately, and incredibly proudly completely serve myself the absolute very first incredibly massive, beautiful, hot portion of the delicious food. I carefully place the steaming hot golden smothered chicken and the rich creamy baked macaroni directly onto my own beautiful heavy ceramic plate, completely inhaling the absolutely magnificent savory aroma of my own hard work. I sit down completely, peacefully, smiling brightly, feeling absolutely, incredibly, deeply, profoundly, totally loved, completely, entirely, unconditionally, right here, now, today. I look directly into the bright digital camera lens, speaking entirely directly to every single, incredibly beautiful, strong, powerful person currently entirely watching this massive, incredible, entirely true story of absolute, complete survival today. They thought my age made me weak. They forgot that I built my kingdom from the dirt up. Never let anyone, not even blood, make you a second-class citizen in your own home. Have you ever had to legally evict a toxic family member? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more. Please hit that entirely beautiful, massive like button and completely share this massive, entirely, absolutely, totally, completely powerful story, completely for absolutely, entirely, completely, more incredibly, entirely complete, totally amazing videos. Do not entirely, completely, absolutely, incredibly forget to completely, absolutely, entirely click the notification bell so you never entirely, completely, absolutely miss another massive, incredibly, completely beautiful, empowering story of absolute, complete, total, entirely massive survival today. You absolutely deserve to live a completely peaceful, incredibly happy, totally safe, beautiful, massive, wonderful life without any incredibly toxic, deeply horrible, manipulative, terrible, completely pathetic, entirely greedy family members dragging your massive, incredible, absolute, ultimate, highly beautiful success down completely forever right now.